All right, great. Yeah, because
And
I can't look away.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is pretty much it. So
Yeah, very
I guess I'll start with I was kind of just wondering because you taught anthropology of biology to me.
Yes.
So what's your main focus of study? Because what are you going for right now? Because you're a TA, but
So I am a graduate student in the anthropology department, but my particular focus is on archaeology.
okay, that makes sense. So what brought you into the archaeology side? Like what sparked your interest for that?
Yeah, so archaeology, so my undergraduate studies were in history, military science, and anthropology. Archaeology really appealed to me. After I graduated from undergrad, I worked for the state of New York for the Parks and Preservation Department. And the materiality of history, and to be completely blunt with you, the employability of archaeology is much better than history. And I really loved my first introduction to archaeology in an anthropological sense was in a LiDAR mapping project and associated excavations with a mining project, a hydraulic mining, if you're familiar. So it's basically they directed these streams, redirected them, and used them to mine gold in Georgia. And this obviously leaves a huge cultural legacy and a huge ecological legacy. And that was the first thing I engaged with in archaeology. And it really struck a chord to me because I'd always been someone who was fascinated in history, fascinated in culture and heritage and economics, but with a mind or with sort of an intellectual curiosity in a more scientific direction, right? I liked that you have these experiments. I liked engaging with certain kinds of technology. And I found archaeology to be such an incredible fusion of that. And anthropology as a whole, where you can bring in these cutting-edge technologies as well as really engaging and complex political, historical sort of theory to wrap these technologies around. So it's not just making a map or it's not just running a test on an artifact, but then putting that into a context and telling stories that we don't often get to hear.
Yeah, I mean, the past is kind of a story we don't see at all. There is no internet or, much writing before. And I think it's very interesting to see, the people that came before us based on what they left behind. And that's so forgotten, too. And that's why I was very intrigued, like I told you before. I wanted to talk about the footprints that were just found and, the implication of that. Because groundwork, because I don't remember all my learnings from last year.
Don't tell me that. Don't tell me that.
But so how long? It was 200,000 years that we've been anatomically modern humans.
Yes.
Around so?
Roughly. But roughly, yes.
As of now, from all the findings that we have.
Yeah, exactly.
So, and that we've found that was mostly in Africa, Southern Africa.
Originating in Africa, Kenya, Tanzania, early hominids in South Africa. A really interesting element, if we want to talk about integrating modern politics into this, is, when you look at the countries where we found early hominid fossils, let's pretend we're back in class, right?
Yeah.
What is, South Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, do you hear about a lot of civil wars in those countries?
Yeah.
Well, compared to Africa.
Oh, yeah, true.
Not a ton, right? Those are fairly stable. They're fairly well developed. There is, it's not my specific sub area, but speaking with people who do focus on that, there is likely a great wealth of early hominid fossils in countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, in countries in Central Africa that are tragically continue to be somewhat destabilized. But yeah, certainly in Africa, Southern and Eastern Africa, and God willing, we'll be able to find some more information when these societies and when these countries are able to deal with more pressing issues.
So,
first.
Do archaeologists are they mining? I guess what's the proper term? Excavating over there right now, or are they still just waiting because you need like government approval
You
from
do.
them, or
Yeah, you do need government approval. So we do have, not here at the university, but there are archaeologists and paleoanthropologists who are working in Kenya and Tanzania, a lot in South Africa right now. But typically, the way that these sort of paleoarchaic, very early human fossils are found, and pre-human fossils are found, is, I don't want to say accidentally, that implies the wrong, but it's usually, a geologist is looking for oil and we find a rock layer that has these fossils, or someone's developing industry or a park or whatever else, and we find these fossils. So, just because of the scale of Africa and
there's so
these
much
are
land to
small-
cover.
Exactly.
Like, how are you supposed to just be like, guess and say, you know what, there's going to be a fossil this far down. Even if you're like a foot off or
Exactly.
an inch off, you can miss
Exactly.
everything.
Yeah, this is very different from like the work that I do in more recent finds where, okay, a building has a footprint this big, 40 by 40 feet. If I do a shovel test anywhere, I'm probably going to find it.
Mm-hmm.
With these early fossils, that's part of the reason that even if you could get approval from, say, the Congolese government, where would you begin?
Yeah.
Right? You're going to go through the rainforest just digging shovel tests down 40 meters? No, that's insane.
Yeah, that doesn't make sense. Is there like a technology? Because I know in fishing boats,
Mm-hmm.
they have like the radar that goes down to see if there's any fish beneath. Is there something like that for the land to see if there's any? Because there has to be like a different consistency of the bones to maybe give a signal.
So what you're describing is called a GPR. It's a ground penetrating radar. It's a technology that I've used under one of the professors here. It's an incredible technology, especially for finding artifacts. So walls, hearths, so very heavily built up stones, as well as iron. It's great for locating iron in the ground. Unfortunately, fossils are stone, actually. They're no longer organic material. And because they are so small and because they're so, inherently, right, integrated into the surrounding rock, and because of the limitation of GPR, you basically need a fairly flat, clear surface. To my knowledge, there has never been, a really successful systematic location of fossils with GPR, because again, we're talking humans, right? We're talking even pre-human late hominids. These are small finger bones. These are not, think about it like this, right? How different is a pebble that we might find outside from, my wrist joint?
True.
Right, if you're thinking about this in a geological sense.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. Also, I was thinking because there's been a lot of ice. There's been a few ice ages. And wouldn't like these glaciers that are just pretty much erasing everything in their path make it a lot harder to find?
Yeah, absolutely. It's our belief currently with modern science that the areas where humans evolved have never experienced glaciation, like that sort of heartland of Africa. But certainly once we begin to expand out, that's absolutely an issue that we need to concern ourselves with.
Because I feel like it's interesting for the North Americas, or I guess North America, because we thought how long we thought it was like 11,000 years ago that people migrated over to North America and started settling here because of these new footprints. It makes it more like 20,000 years ago. Do you think that has something to do with these glaciers coming over and sweeping all that stuff off? Or like, why have we not found more from the past?
Right, absolutely. So what you're talking about at about 11,000 or 12,000 years ago was termed the Clovis migration. They're associated with a certain type of projectile point, very complex point. And then these current footprints they found in, I believe, White Sands in New Mexico date, again, 20,000 years ago, if not older. We have had a few other sites from this, what archaeologists call pre-Clovis. There's Monteverde in Chile, which is maybe 18,000 years ago. There's Galton in Texas, which is obviously very close to New Mexico, about 20,000 years ago. The glaciation does recede about 10,000 years after these footprints. But humans, I want to make sure I say this very carefully, humans are not believed to have occupied North America pre-glaciation.
Okay.
So it would be more an element, when we're talking about erasure of these human footprints, it's more an element for one, if you are, say, living, like look at the Inuit, for example, if you're living, the contemporary Inuit, in a glaciated environment, right, you're not going to leave remains in the earth, right, because you have that ice cap, right, you have these ice sheets over the earth. And a bigger thing that's erasing all of these early human sites is actually the sea level rise. Sea levels from the melting of the glaciation to modernity, I think some have estimated like 30 feet of sea level rise.
That's a good amount.
Yeah. I mean, let me put it like this: Australia and Indonesia were connected to Asia by a land bridge at that point. You know, Russia and Alaska were connected by a land bridge, just to give you an idea of just how much sea level has risen.
That's a lot. So, are we focusing any efforts on marine archaeology?
Yeah, some people are. It's not my forte. I can't speak to any new discoveries of that. But if you're asking my opinion or where I think we're going to find the sites, absolutely, that's where we're going to find it.
I feel like we should definitely be focusing more. Instead of, I love the space travel. I'm a big space guy. But I feel like we should study our planet first and to like discover the ocean, which we have no knowledge of.
Absolutely.
Because I think it's so interesting. I know like the Atlantis stuff gets so much hate, but like Plato was talking about this lost land that got overtaken by sea levels, it's sunken, and like it makes sense. I was watching this video talking about like the glaciers and the water level, and like exactly where he said it was, like the sea level rose a bunch. And like, why don't we just look underwater, see if there's some remains there? I find it pretty fascinating. But because the coasts, I feel like that's where most people would inhabit too. Yep. And if any little sea level rises, then it's all washed away. And
absolutely,
it makes sense that there's not too much in the central masses. Yeah,
in a way, you know, when we look at these people from 20,000 years ago, all of these remains that we're finding, all of these material traces, you know, if we want to put them in sort of a colloquial term, if we want to be in a cutesy term, you know, these are the hill people, right? These are the Hicks. These are the people living away from the major civilization points, right? Because these were complex human societies, not necessarily agricultural, but certainly very well developed. And that would have been by the coast, right? We really have, it's very challenging to find that, right? Yeah. Think of how challenging it is to find them on land. And as you say, the sea is something we know so little about. There's so much change on the base of the sea. It's one thing that makes it very challenging.
Because it's always overturning.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. So that would add a challenge there.
Yeah. You know, so we have an example, if we want to talk in Europe, this idea of Doggerland, right? Which is it's currently a plateau under the North Sea. It's between the Netherlands and England. And for millennia, it was not only a land bridge, it was actually very heavily occupied. And this is a case where you could literally, within, you know, perhaps 5 generations, within a degree of a living memory at the time, these people would have seen the land around them swallowed up by water.
That's terrifying.
Yeah. And again, not living memory to today, but in their own lifetimes, they would have very well been able to say, you know, Grandpa lived over there. Grandpa lived under that, you know, wave, basically.
Yeah. That is crazy. And I think it's, so when were like the first major civilizations created as that we know right now? Because I know there's some like in Turkey, how am I forgetting that Teple,
Göbekli Tepe.
Yeah, I can never say Göbekli.
No,
it's such a hard word.
It really is.
But like Göbekli Tepe dates back so far, and it was so advanced. Like they had the proper north to south, where they had to study the astrology to even put it that, and then they buried it too. I was like, this stuff seems so far advanced beyond what people thought of just like hunter-gatherers that we had at the time. Like that doesn't really make sense to me.
Yeah, so what we're learning, and this is actually really interesting interplay between anthropologists who've worked with living groups and archaeologists, is that typically, use the term civilization, right? In archaeology, this has a very specific definition. It's been defined by an archaeologist named Child, V. Gordon Child, back in the 20th century, early 20th century. And it's basically this list of 10 traits that are a certain population density, agriculture, food storage, class division, long distance trade, writing.
Sounds pretty advanced.
Yeah. And, for a long time, that was sort of the definition we used, right? So we look at Sumer and Ur, or the Harappan civilization in the Indus River Valley, China along the Yellow Sea, or the Yellow River. What we've learned more recently from ethnographies in the Pacific Northwest, like the Nadene people, as well as exactly what you say,
Yes,
now I'm stuck on it.
So hard.
Göbekli Tepe, as well as even Stonehenge and the other henges in northwestern Europe, is that hunter-gatherers have, or can have, in a resource-rich environment, a degree of complexity. This has been studied in the Amazon as well. A degree of complexity that we previously believed was unobtainable. And that has been disproven, right? You can have, exactly as you say. So astrology, right? You bring up this idea of the astrology of being able to, or astronomy, essentially. They're obviously at that time they would have been very interconnected. But this idea of studying the stars and taking the time to map them and to note, which stars in the north and what seasons the stars arise, that is indicative of class differentiation, right? Think about it today. We're only allowed to study these esoteric topics because other people are farming and other people are bringing me my, water in pipes. And that's, general example. It was thought, hunter-gatherers, everyone's the same, it's egalitarian. But clearly, when there are enough resources, when you have hunters and gatherers who can supply a priestly class or a noble class, you can have these very complex cosmologies and labor relations and trade. That's a big one as well. These Anatolian sites and the henges in northwestern Europe, the megaliths in the Mediterranean world, they're pilgrimage sites, right? The grain sites in Ireland, there are people traveling hundreds of miles, maybe even thousands of miles, who are hunter-gatherers. And this is something that for a long time, was not accepted by the field, but it's been proven within the last 40, 50 years. That idea that there's multiple forms of complexity.
Yeah, because it does seem like they're very far advanced. And it makes sense if they're modernly atomic humans. When you got a full belly, we've seen it in history, there's like a renaissance of sorts where you could start to think instead of just trying to survive.
Absolutely.
So that's why it always made me think of why did it take so long for these people to come together? Because it seems like when people come together and they're near water and they can hunt and do all this thing, they start to innovate. Because 5 generations ago, there's the Civil War and we were horse and buggy, and now it's just a complete technological advancement in just such a short amount of time. And it's so hard for me to believe that they had thousands of generations and they didn't really get anywhere.
Yeah. I think there's a few things that I find very interesting in some of your phrasing. So for one, you said this idea of, well, why didn't past humans, why didn't our ancestors or our cousins, invent these urban centers earlier? There's a train of thought in anthropology that I admit, I find very romantic, I find very appealing in a lot of ways, that questions, is agriculture actually better? When we look at the people, these complex hunter-gatherers, Pacific Northwest or Anatolia or, Northwestern Europe, and of course in the Far East as well, which I'm less knowledgeable about. These hunter-gatherer complex societies, their skeletons that we uncover, they seem to be living longer than people in urban centers later on. There is a class differentiation, but it seems to be less severe, right?
How long would they usually live for?
It's rough to draw these numbers from very limited remains, but they could be capable of living 60s to 80s.
It's not too bad.
No, and that's the reality is the child mortality is always going to be high before scientific medicine. Child mortality is always high. But once you escape maybe like 12, say 8 to 12, once you get past that, even in an agricultural society, you could be expected to live 50, 60, 70. So that's one of these questions is like, well, agriculture is great. I call this I call this like the Civ mindset or the, total war mindset, right? These video game mindsets where urbanization is great for advancing technology from a top-down perspective. It looks really cool on a map, right?
Yeah.
You say, these are my borders, and we'd get this great writing systems and everything else. But if you're actually an average person in that society, you may not necessarily be better off. You are probably eating a less varied diet. You're working much harder. There were more breaks in a hunter-gatherer world or a pastoralism world. And so you end up with these really interesting questions where a lot of what we consider progress and advancement, we need to question how we're engaging with that. So, for example, people today, the average height of a Western male, I believe, is something like 5'10", 5'11". That is the tallest humans have ever been of our genetic lineage since the Middle Ages. So this is a really interesting, we like to think, it's been progress, the Industrial Revolution was great, the Renaissance was great, all this other stuff. But when we actually look at the body, when we treat the body as the nexus of power and progress and advancement, I guess I shouldn't make a hand motion for a podcast, but there's this dip, there's this inverted bell curve that as we come out of the medieval age, as we begin to urbanize, there's all these cool technologies and all these great, sort of scientific thinkers that we like to associate with. But the actual lived experience of a person from the medieval age into very recently would have been more war, less freedom, less varied diet, and we're physically weaker, physically smaller.
Why do you think that is?
I mean, it's a cause of urbanization, and it's
Okay.
a cause of inequality. So that's one of these, which is sort of now almost being caught up, right? The technology is finally there, but imagine it like this. If you lived in England in the 10th century, well, maybe not 10th, let's say 11th century,
Okay.
you're probably not going to be called for a war, right? That's what your lord is for. That's what these mercenaries are for. You are likely to own your own home. You're likely to have a degree of cattle. You have any church festival day off to spend with your family. It's a pretty good life.
Yeah.
We fast forward to that person's ancestor in, say, the 1700s, right? In this Victorian era in the 1800s, they do not own their own property. They are living in tenement houses. They are conducting wage labor. They have a very undiversified diet. They have massive pollutants in the air. And compared to our, medieval yeomen, they do not know their social, quote unquote superiors, right? You're not likely in Victorian London to have dinner with your boss. Whereas a yeoman in the Middle Ages could approach his lord, right? You're also drafted in the modern world. There's this idea of a state that has a right to your body as a man. Which did not really exist in the Middle Ages. It was very much contractual. It was, I will fight for you in exchange for X, but you can't
Force me.
Yeah, you can't levy me. I mean, you could in like a very literal sense, but the legal fiction isn't there. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does. So how do we see that as in our present? Are we still having these we are still having that. Is like there a way, like, okay, if you could have like your ideal society, like what do you think works best for humans? Purely from a body and our mind type of thing.
Well,
I know that's a hard question, but
So people have done research in a sort of evolutionary psych and a sociobiology perspective, which again is not my field, so I can't speak to the veracity of it, but I've read the results. The human mind can only process a certain number of individuals as true individuals. I think it's about 150 to 250.
Wow. That's
And-
way smaller than I thought it would
Well,
be.
and think about that in your own life. How many people do you actually consider as fully three-dimensional people, right? With lives and with interests, and that you. And I'm not saying that we're all sociopaths.
No,
It's
no.
like,
People are NPCs, like driving down the road. Like you don't
Right.
think that they.
Exactly. And you can care about them. You can say, oh, this is my countryman, or this is a brother in my faith, or a sister, in a kinship diagram. But we don't tend to think of them as we just don't have that mental headspace.
And that makes sense evolutionary too,
Yeah.
because if we're living in small tribes, we wouldn't need
Exactly.
these massive.
And bear in mind, that's much higher than many other primates. We are quite good at glomming new people into our groups. And 150 is a lot more than, say, a chimpanzee, which I think is something in like the teens to 50. So we're doing, it's still quite impressive, but I would say definitely a small scale society. I would say a society, if we draw on sort of a Jungian idea of humanity, we need certain archetypes represented. You need people to have. Max Weber writes about this in the mid 20th century. He says like all humans have a god. If you want to put that with a lowercase g, right? Everyone needs to believe in something, whether that's a nation, whether that's science, whether that's a conventional religion. We're drawn to these sort of archetypes, so you definitely need some type of spiritual wellness. And I would say, I take a lot from this sort of Ludditic philosophy. So these Luddites are these people who protest the Industrial Revolution, and in modern culture, they're sort of laughed at. They're like, oh, they hated everything. They wanted to smash typewriters, but that wasn't the case, right? They were people who opposed the adoption of the loom, the mechanical loom, because it was hurting them as laborers. It would put them out of work. It would make their work incredibly less valuable, and that's something that I see, right? Not that technology's bad. There's a lot of technologies that are very emancipatory. Like look at 3D printing, right?
Yeah.
You want to talk about my ideal, it's spiritually sound, it's local communities, and you have access in a very literal sense to your means of production, right? You're 3D printing your technology, you're growing food sustainably and locally, you're politically organized in some way. Clearly, that's something that humans develop around the world. But yeah, I definitely think we need to have that view of technology, not progress is good for progress's sake. I think is very dangerous, and I would argue history has shown that it's very dangerous.
Yeah.
Whereas we need to ask, okay, AI, is that going to help us? Is that going to self-actualize us? If we make robots that can do all of our jobs, what happens to us? If we make, look at our smartphones or look at social media, especially social media, that is a drug. That is something that addicts people. That is something that is not good for our mental health, right? But at the same time, I'm not saying firebomb the internet, right? We need to find this middle ground. We need to find responsible ways of technology.
Yeah.
Maybe it's just because I'm a 90s kid, but
I agree with you 100%.
Alter globalization was a very big movement. Brown, green, red, or black, green, red was these big things in the 90s of sort of, we're all this big human community. We need to work together, but we need to do it in a way that is empowering and culturally sensitive and ecologically sustaining, not just, push everybody together and fight for a scrap of capital or serve some, Marxist dictatorship. That's not a sustainable future, in my opinion.
Yeah, I'm with you 100% because we see it like, especially what scares me the most is this genetic engineering stuff. Like they're literally just advancing with it, and it doesn't seem to have any restrictions on it or any regulations, and that bit scares me because I've seen glowing rats with firefly DNA, and someone tried to do that with a dog, and then they're trying to cure. But there's already like genetic babies being made, or designer babies. I guess all babies are genetic, but like designer babies and that kind of stuff. And I was reading an article on transhumanism, which I'd like to hear your perspective on, because that it seems very plausible right about now. Like, this article was written in like the 2000s, and it seems so science fiction. And now we have Elon Musk literally making a Neuralink to pretty much make us cyborgs, and it feels like our evolution is going into to combine with technology.
So the first thing I want to say is that there is a very policy wonk, deep theory, anthropology definition of cyborg that is different from the one that you and I are going to use in this conversation. So there's this argument that anytime we engage with technology, we're doing an act of a cyborg, which I if that's a theoretical framework that helps people, good for them, but I don't think it's great in terms of outreach, because there definitely is something different between, I use this ring to show where I went to school, but you know what? I can take it off. Yeah. Versus a neural link that is
in your head.
Exactly. Absolutely. Ian Hodder, who's a very famous archaeologist, is doing a lot of work right now on how technology has always shaped human evolution. What worries me, if we're talking, I admit the genetics are in my conception less worrying than AI and automation technology. That's what really, gives me the cold sweats.
Yeah.
What worries me is when transhumanism becomes almost post-humanism, when we stop letting humanity or, our religious traditions or our cultural traditions, when we stop letting these guide us, and instead we let the technology guide us, right? What happens when these little neural links are used, to mine our data, or to subtly influence us to buy this or vote this way, or even something as simple as, a computer saying, actually, this is the most progressive path for us to take, or this is the best way to achieve more, right? And that's what's sort of spooky to me about that transhuman idea is, right, anthropology is literally the study of mankind. It's the study of humanity. I think we need to keep humanity at the center of that.
Yeah. I mean, some people will argue that we're just, I don't believe in this, but that this is just a necessary step we need to take. Because we could become immortal if we just scan our minds. Because I believe in a soul, but some people, most physicalists, whatever, they think if you scan your mind and you put it in a computer, a robot, then you're infinite. You have all your memories and you could live forever. Right. And you're just a super intelligent, I guess you're not even carbon-based anymore.
Silicon.
Yeah, you're silicon-based super intelligence. And that just doesn't seem like there's something just fundamentally that seems like what makes us is our biology, our hearts pumping, our minds working together. And it just doesn't seem like we'd be alive if we were in a computer.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And again, this may be my own. So I'm also a devout person. So of course, believe in a soul and all that. So the immortality, I think we sort of can get that another way. Yeah. And which a lot of humans historically have believed, right, in an eternity and a divinity through the soul, whether that's a reincarnation in the Hindu belief, salvation in a Christian or Islamic belief, and thousands and millions of other ways to believe that. I also agree with you that there is something phenomenological about the human experience that we cannot be. I find a great danger in this hyper-rationalistic approach to the world, right? And as I say this as someone who employs science, uses science, I'm not like one of these Looney Tunes or like, we can never know anything. Yeah. It's all subjective. Like, I do believe in facts. I do believe in inquiry based on evidence. But when you try to reduce the human brain, which is, this organic, super complex thing, to not even touch on the spiritual element that many people, myself included, really do believe in, to reduce that down to code, to ones and zeros, to numbers, is I agree with you. It's a facsimile of life. In some ways, I see it as almost an immaturity. It's a very fearful thing in the Western world. And I say Western, more westernized, industrialized, whatever you want to call the worldview where, there is only the here and now. You are only the individual, right? Your family doesn't matter. Your culture doesn't matter. Your religion doesn't matter. It's just you. That is the mindset in my mind that is drawn to these pseudo-immortalities, because even if you're not a religious man or woman, for much of the world, your children are your immortality. The fact that your genes, that's very biological, isn't it, right?
Yeah.
Your genes will carry on, or your nephews, or, that is a legacy. Or maybe you create something. Maybe you can create, an organization or a company or an activist group that you're very passionate, and that's your legacy. This idea that we need to salvage some shadow of our conscious mind strikes me as, in some ways, elitist, right? Because surely this won't be available to everyone, will it?
Exactly.
And it strikes me as very, very unadventurous, right? Aren't how are these people not curious? Are they right? Is there nothing? Is there something? I mean, yeah, it's never been a philosophy that's, and we go back as far as the organicists of classical Greek thought, of early Christian and Islamic thought, who say that the body is our vessel for the soul, or even a Descartesian thought, right? Or Cartesian ideas of the early modern period, where the body is a fundamentally aesthetic machine, right? It's this idea that the body allows us to experience senses that our mind interpret as life and emotion, and what he would have called animal magnetism, which is a whole other maybe that one's not true, but I completely agree with what you're saying. I don't think you can capture that on a server.
Yeah. So what do you think connects, because I'm Catholic, and I philosophy, and in my classes and in the field, most people are very physicalist, because their argument is, well, we have no evidence of the soul, because you can't locate it. It's a spiritual thing. So how do you think the soul, or whatever the spiritual thing is, connects with our bodies here? Because I know Descartes thought it resided in the pineal gland, which kind of makes sense now. Because now it's funny, like they just found that it releases DMT.
Yes.
And I'm like, DMT takes you to another frequency of whatever. But I thought that was kind of just an interesting thing. They didn't know what it was. It had a bunch of folds, and it wasn't a duplicate. It didn't have another side on the other thing. But do you have any thought of how it connects?
So I myself am Anglican, Anglo-Catholic. Obviously my father's family is very Irish Catholic. In terms of that connectivity, I am often drawn to an epistemological argument rather than maybe a biophysical one, which obviously, you're right about the pineal. You're right about these questions of, well, why do we have these organs if not to experience something revelatory? But in terms of epistemology, to look for the soul with science is almost akin to explaining volcanoes with God.
Yeah.
Right? I really do believe there is... I can't remember for the life of me who said this quote, but it's basically an idea that, science can tell us how, and religion can tell us why. Right?
I think my priest said that to me once. I think it was like St. August. I don't want to say St. Augustine if I don't know it, but I think it was some saint.
Yeah.
But it makes sense. We're measuring it with the wrong thing.
Exactly. Yeah.
Do you think humans even have the I guess it won't even be technology, but the resources to measure this kind of stuff? Like, will we ever have proof? Because I guess it's the mystery of faith is what the Catholics always say. Right. So
I guess for me, it comes down to this question, and I'm sure a lot of this is just it's innate to Christian, Islamic, and latter day sort of theology that says, well, faith is powerful because you don't know it, right? Look at the Gospel of St. Matthew to St. Thomas, blessed are those who do not see but still believe. But you can look at that cross-culturally as well, right? All ancestral groups have had some type of spiritualism, some type of a complexity that could not be simply measured and simply defined by a rational science. So in my opinion, and again, I've never tried to capture a soul, but in my mind, I don't know if you could do that, right? I don't know if you could convince science of faith, because they are just, in my mind, again, very divergent epistemologies. So if I can raise a comparison, I'm sure you're familiar with the placebo effect in science. When people who believe in indigenous medicine, whether that's Chinese medicine, whether that's traditional European medicine, Hispanic medicine, American Indian, when people who believe in indigenous medicine are given indigenous medical treatments, they sometimes get better. We can see this biologically, that they are physically getting better, even though the science of these treatments says, well, this doesn't work. If we look at Europe, right, maybe being touched by the bone of a saint, or if we look at, North American indigenous practice with certain leaves or certain herbs that science says, well, that doesn't work, it's not enough potency, and they just write it off as placebo. It's mind over matter to the body. And that's how they need to describe it in that framework. But if you have a syncretic view with faith, then, maybe that really is God or the spirit of an ancestor, or, I don't see that these frameworks have to be opposed, but I also don't think you can force them into one.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Does that make sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like we've lost a lot of our spiritual side as humans, especially when the colonists came and just wiped out all the shamans because they were like the source of power of their tribe. Right. And that's like a very big disconnect now, because I really do believe you need the spiritual side along with what we have now for a healthy relationship in life. And I feel like we can kind of see the consequences of not being spiritually present with all the war and all the capitalism's good, but the way we take it all the way of just let's make money, because I do think we need competition to make products better. But when it's to the point where it's just anything to make a quick buck, that's where I'm like, it gets a little dangerous.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting to read accounts, especially in North America. So, we want to talk about lost religious traditions. Look at the Romans expanding into Gaul, right? Completely wiping out these Druidic faith traditions. And then in North America, it's really fascinating how different, colonizing religious groups treat indigenous faith practice. So the Aztec religion, right, is treated as openly demonic, right? They, as you say, the priests are killed, the holy texts are destroyed. But we look at the Inca, who are, this is very simplifying, but their primary deity was a solar deity. And the Catholic Church said, okay, we can work with that. We've already incorporated a couple solar deities. We can work with that.
Yeah.
And with a lot of North American indigenous beliefs, Algonquin beliefs, as well as Haudenosaunee beliefs, they are able to be worked into a very Christian framework, because there is already this creator God. There's this conception of, well, he's in and among people. It's really interesting to see, if we want to talk about comparative religion, a lot of the American Indian nations, which still exist today, are actually very devoutly Christian in their own framework, because they believed at time of contact, and I'm sure many still believe today, in that the spiritual was very immediately powerful. And when they saw that the Catholic priests, the Jesuits, right, who were very anthropological, right, they would go in and learn the indigenous ways of life, they would live among the indigenous, they would eat their food, they would write in their own language, they would give them scripts. What many of the indigenous saw was that the shaman's magic, to use that reductive term, was not as powerful as this new Jesuit technique. And many times you would also have the inverse, right? You have a very famous story from Saint Marie among the Indians, which is right here in Syracuse, where these Jesuits arrived and they're healing people, they're doing medicine, and then there's this horrible hunt, and they're basically driven out of the camp because it's like, well, clearly this magic is not good. So it's this very interesting synergy, which goes back to what you're saying about the recognition of a spiritual as powerful. And that was something that both sides of contact shared, both Europeans and American Indians and other indigenous groups. They both understood that the spiritual was a very real thing, that was a very real concern, and had very real impacts on day-to-day life. And I completely agree. Yeah, that's a real danger that we've lost that. It's hard to capitalize on a spiritual. You can't sell a soul for $1.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting too how these people have been spiritual all over the globe that weren't in contact with each other too.
Absolutely.
Spirituality, music, and language spring up everywhere.
Yes.
Which I find so fascinating. And do they even have a link why this stuff is everywhere it is, or any ideas?
There's a thought with language that it may have been pre-Homo sapien, so we may have all evolved from a speaking group, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because dolphins have language, kind of.
Yeah,
they have squeals.
Yeah, they have complex speech, not necessarily language fully.
Okay.
But yeah, absolutely. So we may have evolved that together. Music, and again, I can't speak to the veracity in either direction. It's too far out of my wheelhouse. But some anthropologists have theorized that music actually predates conversational speech, that we would mimic either other primates in a sort of singing, or even something as simple as mimicking birds, mimicking other animals to communicate before the development of sort of language. And when we see this in a lot of ritual today, right? In Christian churches, we sing. In many indigenous beliefs, they have a very powerful vocal rhythmic element, right? Of course, the Rig Vedas are given as poems and songs to be sung in India. And yeah, in terms of spirituality is interesting in my mind, because that's the one that is really seems to appear in a lot of different places that may not have a shared lineage. And even our cousins, right, in Neanderthal has a religious tradition that we've been able to uncover. Yes.
What was that?
We know that they would bury the dead respectfully. We know that there is some belief in what's called sympathetic magic. So the idea that if you do something, it has an impact that's related to it. So,
like karma kind of a thing?
No. Okay, here's a good example, right? Say that you are... This is not a Neanderthal example, it's a human example.
Okay.
Ötzi the Iceman, right, from the Alps, very early human. They would tattoo in locations where there was joint pain. Because basically the idea was, your joints hurt, we need to redraw these connections, we will do that with ink, and therefore the connections will be redrawn. It's a very insulting term, but the idea of a voodoo doll is, I think, the easiest way to explain sympathetic magic. And again, that's a problematic term for some cases, but this idea that, I want to hurt someone, I will hurt this representation of them.
Okay.
Or something like, I want to keep my girlfriend in my mind, so I will keep a lock of her hair. It's this idea that you do something in a small scale and it's ritually magnified on a spiritual level. So the Neanderthal had a principle of that. There may have been elements of fire worship or fire in spirituality, but that's a wide stretch. But it might be where a lot of spiritual concepts originate is in fire.
Yeah,
we know that our social complexity is likely tied to the domestication of fire. And when we think about fire, if we try to put ourselves back in their minds, fire is so complex.
It's life.
It's
life. You need it.
You need it. And just think about how hard it is to conceptualize fire if we really try to think about it. I can give you some of my fire, and I have the same amount of fire.
True.
Fire, I cannot touch it, but it can hurt me. It can spring from nothing, but only in certain circumstances. Only the elders would likely carry this fire. They would have the embers. And I'm sure we've all stared into a campfire.
Yeah.
Right?
It's beautiful. It's like
beautiful.
the only chemical reaction we could see.
Yes.
I think that's so cool. And we talked about it in class too.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
People would gather around the campfire for warmth at night, share stories, and there's the brain to gut. What is that? The brain to gut hypothesis, or is that what it's called? Theory?
Yeah.
Where you could explain it better than I could, but just once we got fire, our guts weren't have to do as much work because we could take the nutrients, so that extra stuff goes to your brain to use it better.
No, that's 100% right. There's, in most primates, their largest caloric expenditure is in their gut. In humans, it's in our brain. For exactly that reason. The fire, or today any food processing, is doing the work so our gut doesn't have to. And yeah, exactly. We're sitting around the fire. That expands our day by a lot, right? Because now you can exist. And it also hyper dramatizes the human phase, right? We can think about this. Look at someone around the fire. All of your emotions are heightenedly visible because of the way the fire reflects upon us.
Do you think that made us more sociable to pick up on social cues?
Absolutely, yeah. Or if not cues, then at the very least, it gave us more time for social expression because you cannot do anything else, right? What else can you do at night? You can't go hunt. It's too dark. You can't forage. It's too dangerous. Really, all you can do is sit around the fire. Not all you can do. I don't mean to limit the human experience, but that's the best time to just sort of sit around, parlay, have a conversation.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I was wondering, when we were talking about this, I always wanted to ask you, so if a raccoon eats all of our trash and all our food, would it have a similar gut to brain type of evolution? Because it feels like a very simple experiment we could do on another animal to see if we can heighten its intelligence by giving it processed food.
Yeah, so one thing to keep in mind with that is that it is a Darwinian theory, which is to say that it only acts as a limiting factor on selection, which is to say that it's generational, right? So first of all, this is over thousands of years. So you couldn't do it with a raccoon. It have to be something with a much shorter lifespan.
Okay.
And it only works if the ones that are, say we're doing like rats or mice or something, it would only work if the ones that were given the processed food also received a benefit in their sexual reproduction.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
No, that does make sense.
So, because remember, it has to originate from a random mutation. If, from a purely materialistic sense, right? If you accept church teaching, then it's a guided mutation from God. But from a materialistic sense, it would be a specific mutation that says, hey, you're going to have less energy in your gut, and then that becomes available for the brain. So it's not that. So, for example, if we do your experiment, if we do that with a rat or a mouse or even a raccoon, if they don't develop that unique mutation, then it might not occur. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that does make sense.
So the reason that chimps the reason that early hominid primates were primed to that was likely because there was some transformation in our gastrointestinal tract at that time, right? Whether we were transitioning from trees to savanna or savanna to whatever was going on ecologically seemed to have primed our guts to develop these new mutations.
That makes sense. And I was also on that vein of going from savanna to a forest, because they still don't really know why we're bipedal, right? Like why we stood up. And that, I feel, that always bothers me because I look outwards, I'm big into alien stuff, and they're all, from the ones, whatever, it's all anecdotal, whatever, but they're all bipedal also. Like the grays or these other, they're all standing on two legs. And it's just no other animal that I guess kangaroos, but they kind of go down on fours too.
Right.
Bears, but they're mostly on fours.
Yeah.
So I'm just wondering, is there any thought of why we stood up? Because the idea of to grab or to travel fast, like we don't, I don't know why.
The origin, I think Jung would have an example for why alien sightings are bipedal, which has to do with the shadow, and it has to do with these psychological archetypes of the other. But that, or maybe they are just actually extraterrestrials. Who knows? But so I can't necessarily speak to that. But in terms of human evolution, sadly, I can't even speak to that necessarily, because that is a very real question in the field.
I feel like that's an important one too.
It absolutely is. There's a lot of theories about it. One is that savanna hypothesis, right? That as the trees recede, we become bipedal to better travel across the savanna. But the obvious counterargument to that is the baboon. The baboon is also a savanna-dwelling animal that is primarily quadrupedal. There's obviously, like you said, this idea of reaching between branches, but we know many primates that still live in our boreal world are not bipedal. It is a question that we do not necessarily have a good answer to. We know that bipedalism, we know how it developed in the sense of we have models. So first off, humans began walking upright, but were not obligate bipeds. We were habitual bipeds. So I think you might have seen it in class, but a chimpanzee can walk on its hind feet, but it looks like a goober, right? Its arms are super long, it's not stable, and that wouldn't be comfortable for it in the long term.
Its hips.
Exactly. And as we go forward, our ancestors are habitually bipedal, so we walk on our two back feet often, but not primarily. And then later on, we could become obligate bipeds. So you and I could not walk on all 4 feet.
That would be kind of uncomfortable.
Exactly. Exactly.
And it's strange how our backs still haven't adapted with it either. Like there's so much pain. And these chairs don't help at all. Like all these chairs make my back go like this. I'm like, go with the spine.
Yes. The chairs also, they actually weaken our lumbar muscles, which make us much worse at sitting up. So it adds to back pain. It's one of these things that, we were talking about that rationality and the dangers of being hyper-rational. We've almost done this to ourselves when these people make these beautiful, you have one in the corner, like these lumbar support chairs. That is one of the worst things you can do to your back in the long term. It'll feel good while you're sitting in them, but it'll make your back so much weaker. We can look at our shoes, right, with this incredible arch support, which is great. Except when that's all of what we wear, it actually weakens our feet compared to ancestral human groups and people who still do not use, Western footwear today.
Yeah, it seems
you can't out-engineer our plans, whether you believe these are purely biological or God-made or whatever else. A lot of things that we've done to improve it have.
Yeah, we should be working with the body and working around, not just what is comfortable to us. It reminds me of like the short pleasures and then the greater pleasures, like eating candy. Like it's a pleasure at the moment, but it's not really too good for you if you keep doing it.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Yeah. So that always interests my thinking, because like there has to be a reason we stood up. There has to be. And that bothers me. But I think I found it interesting too. I was always wondering why everyone's like right-handed. And like I was doing a little research, tell me if I'm wrong, but it correlated with like tool use I saw. So as we evolved with tools, like the left side of our brain was like, I forgot which part of the brain worked with tools, but because the left side, the left hemisphere is connected with the right, which I found kind of interesting. But I because they were talking about like the teeth marks on like wool when they chip their tooth with the tool. But I find that kind of strange because we're all right-handed, I guess just passed down. But do you know of any like evolutionary things of why people would be left-handed? Or like I still don't really get why it would be right-handed too, like why that's passed down so far.
So these are examples of traits that are polygenetic. So there's a lot of different factors that go into them. There's a lot of cultural things, especially now this is an interesting thing to me, is that all the major cultural spheres of the old world, so when I'm saying that, I'm saying, Christendom, the Islamic world, the Indian subcontinent, the Chinese world, and I believe parts of the sub-Saharan world as well. Yeah, because you're right. We're biologically lean towards being right-handed.
Mm-hmm.
I think is it 90% of the population?
Yeah, something like that.
But there are also then these cultural stimuli that reinforce that. There's this idea that, Lucifer is left-handed. There's even before that in Latin, the sinister, right?
Yes.
Drawn from left-handedness. We have similar things in the Vedic religions in India, in the Chinese thought, and again, I believe some sub-Saharan African thought, although I'm not as versed on that as I should be. So it becomes this weird thing where my imagining, and this is purely anecdotal, my imagining is that a lot of people, even in our culture, say, I'm kind of ambidextrous, but I was culturally taught to be right-handed. We see this today. I don't know if you're like this, but I know folks when I used to do kickboxing who are right-handed, but they box southpaw.
Interesting.
Just because that was something that was never sort of culturally, because they didn't take up boxing until they were in their teens. And so that just felt natural, and it was never sort of pushed out of them. So yeah, absolutely. I'm sure there is some type of neurophysical connection to the left side of our brain, but there's also then these cultural entwinements which reinforce what's already a normative biology.
Yeah, and it makes sense for a southpaw too, because if most people are fighting with their right as their dominant hand, and then you get in a fight and you get a left, you're going to win the fight because the person's not going to be expecting it, most likely.
Yeah, same in baseball with left-handed pitchers and batters. Yeah, absolutely.
So I guess there is a genetic advantage in that regard.
Now, it only becomes genetic if you're able to breed more.
Okay. Yeah, so unless you're beating some guys up, you can breed off that.
Which, I mean, maybe, some of those, I think more pro baseball players are left-handed by like a factor of 2 or 3 than the general pop, and I think they have a good number of kids, so maybe that's
funny. So this is kind of a little different.
Yeah.
But going back to like ancestor and I was reading about this meteor that hit like around 11,000, 12,000 years ago, which could have reset everything because they would have made creative major melting of the ice caps, wipe everything off. Then there was another freezing and then another melting type of thing in like 1,000-year span. Which could that have reset human evolution? Because I feel like not human evolution, but human advancement. Because if that could have like wiped out some civilizations and set them back to the start.
Right.
Because I feel like stuff like the pyramids and the Sphinx, they just found, I don't know if this is widely accepted, but on the Sphinx, isn't there erosion that dates it back thousands of years before they actually thought it was?
So that's definitely, if we're talking about that specific example, that's definitely would be considered more of a fringe belief. And I don't want to say that to stop inquiry, right? The pre-Clovis migration was a fringe belief 30 years ago when my advisor was going through, and now he's teaching it to undergrads, right? So I don't want to say fringe is in it's false or it's bad and it'll never be true. But currently, those erosion marks, those marks of water, are not deemed enough to drastically redefine the origin of the Sphinx. I believe it's now just associated with the geology that it was chosen to be built on, if that makes sense.
Not really.
No,
I don't really like the geology that it was built on. So what does that mean? Like,
so either that those stones were chosen because they had that weathering, or it was placed in that spot because it was such an ancient location.
That makes sense.
And again, I'm not an Egyptologist, and there may very well be a valid debate in either direction. But at the moment, that is not the accepted narrative. Does that seem fair?
That makes sense. So, but just for fun, if it was the accepted belief,
right? But I do want to address the other thing, the impact as well.
Oh, yeah. Let's go back to the impact, though, because I find that so interesting.
Yeah, so what I would look to there, something that is very widely accepted, is there's this eruption of a volcano Again, I think it's around that similar in the teens or 20 so odd thousand years ago. And we do know for a very real fact that these events cause a bottleneck in the human genetic lineage. So I think every human today, we know this from maternal mitochondrial DNA. So every human today can descend from a number of human women who I believe we could put in a single auditorium, like a single, maybe even large classroom.
That's nothing. Because I remember
It's it's in the dozens. We're talking about dozens of.
That's like no one.
Yeah.
How? Because you were saying in class there's like more genetic variation of like primates than there are of us.
Yes.
I'm like, that's crazy. How good for humans for being so adaptation or being able to adapt to their circumstances and their environment to go from that small of a group to populate the earth in the billions.
Well, and to repopulate, because we're these large groups, and then these extinction event or near extinction events shrink us down, and then we grow again. We have a very plastic genetic code. So a lot of animals, like we think of dogs, right? We look at dogs. We look at, I don't know if you've ever had somebody with a terrier, but you put that terrier.
I had a Norwich Terrier.
Yeah, you put it around sheep, and you might have never trained it, and it'll start herding. Or you have, pit bulls. They have this instinct to just latch on and never let go. Dogs are not very plastic, right? A lot of what makes up a dog is in its DNA. It's genetics. Humans are not like that, right? And we've learned this in the hard sciences, so-called in the STEM fields. Epigenetics has a huge role in our development. What we're exposed to as a kid, what we're exposed to while we're an infant still in the womb, and that's part of why we're able to bounce back from these events, because it's not that we're just hard-coded for these certain things. We can change so many of our phenotypical expressions solely due to environmental factors.
Good for humans.
Yeah,
We know how to
absolutely.
survive.
Yeah.
Because I feel like that's what let us survive.
Yes.
We may not be the strongest or the fastest, but we are the ones that can adapt to any environment.
Absolutely.
So
we're incredibly plastic.
good for humans. Good job, guys. Which is great. But there's for megafauna, there's like the argument that like humans wipe them out with spears and stuff, but that like doesn't really make sense to me, because there's like how would we have wiped them out that fast with just spears?
I think part of that is fast on a geological time scale is still not necessarily what we might consider fast, right? That's still hundreds or thousands of years. One argument that does lend credence, because it is all theories, right? It is all hypothesis.
Yeah, we don't have time machines. We can't go see.
One argument that it is human is that everywhere that humans have expanded to, regardless of our culture, regardless of our ethnicity, everywhere that we've expanded except Africa, where the animals evolved with us, there has always been a megafaunal extinction. That's true in North America. It's true in Europe, Asia, South Asia, even Australia. And, when we say stone tools, we think of them as maybe like very simple. There are a few things to remember with the megafauna. Megafauna are generally very slow reproduction rate in terms of, think about elephants today, right? That's why they're so endangered, among other reasons, of course.
Bastard poachers.
Yeah, for real. No, absolutely. Humans are also able to organize. So we know, for example, that American Indians, as well as Paleo Indians, would run these large herds off of cliffs. And then there's just, hundreds of dead mammoth, hundreds of dead buffalo more recently, which would be scavenged for what's needed. Other nations would come and take as well and then go back. So it's not just every single dead mammoth is a hunted mammoth. But yeah, to be completely fair, to not give too much onus to humans, climate change is also a major role in this. Right? Humans are expanding in conjunction with a climate that is warming, right? So it's really intrinsically linked, right? Because we do not expand into these regions until the glaciation recedes, generally. Not all the time, but generally. Or if we go by glaciated regions, we come to settle in regions without glaciation, right? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So, you're coming from maybe what's today Manchuria. Okay, you go around the ice caps, and then you come down and you settle in New Mexico and Texas without glaciation. So it's definitely intertwined with the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you're right. If it had just been humans with stone tools and with fire, which is also very important, right? Fire scaring the animals. If it had just been that, maybe there would not have been these extinction events. But when you combined human hunting and harvesting with a changing ecology, that's when you get these events. But that there are mammoths that exist up until the building of the Great Pyramids out in Siberia, because it's not just climatological, right? Mammoths could survive the Earth's climate, but they couldn't survive the climate and the hunting. Does that sort of make sense?
No, that
so
does
it's
make sense.
definitely synergistic.
Yeah. So I kind of, okay, I'll go to the mammoths. Well,
we can go any other, yeah.
No, I was just thinking there's two ways, because I want to talk about bringing back the mammoths.
Yeah.
So yeah, we'll go with that. Like,
Okay.
to me, it just reminds me of Jurassic Park, and I say, what are we doing? Like, this seems like a terrible idea.
Right.
And I don't think it's ever been done in the past before. Maybe
Not to my knowledge, no.
No, and I do not know what the repercussions of this I don't know the word, life.
Yeah,
animation.
Yeah, maybe. Yep, reintroduction. Yeah.
Do you think that's going to have an effect on the environment? Because there's always consequences of our actions, and it doesn't really, to me, seem, unless that I haven't read it, that they've thought about how this is going to affect the world.
Yeah.
Because everything's so connected.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm glad you've definitely taken that to heart from class. Ecology is such a web. It's such a network. No, I don't think anyone has really been able to study what the outspreading effects of bringing back these type of animals would be. And to be honest, I don't think any predictive study could ever really understand everything that's going to happen, right?
Yeah.
Just by the nature of the limitations of our knowledge and our computing and everything else. Excuse me. Yeah, it's one of those things where there's a part of me that's like intellectually curious, right? It's almost a Faustian. It's like, well, we could though. I'd love to hunt a mammoth.
To see it,
right?
Crazy.
Exactly. But absolutely, as you say, there's of course going to be long durée ecological implications. We even see this. So, for example, one of the problems that we deal with today, if we're talking about ecology, in North America especially, is determining what even is an ecological baseline, right? And as we deal with climate change today, whether you accept it as anthropogenic or you give more credence to maybe a natural cycle, obviously I accept an anthropogenic premise.
Yeah, seems like we're kind of messing it up.
Yeah, but even going. So then, I feel comfortable. So we'll accept this anthropogenic premise. What is the climate of North America that we want?
Yeah.
Right? Because when the first Europeans came here, North America was heavily populated by indigenous groups that hunted and farmed and had fires, and they impacted the environment, right? We need to get rid of this very old racist idea of the American Indian as like a fairy in the woods and dances with the wind or whatever the Pocahontas. They adapted to their climate, sure, but they're also human, right? They have an ecological impact. And when a lot of modern naturalism in the 19th century, so maybe early 1820s, 1850s, when they record the nature of North America and South America, they're recording a continent where 90% of the indigenous inhabitants died of disease. 90% died before they ever saw a European or an African.
Why did they die?
From the disease, from the smallpox.
Okay.
They didn't have the, not just smallpox.
The immune system to fight it.
Well, the immunities, right? Same immune system, but they weren't introduced to diseases. So it's similar to what happened in Europe and West Africa with the bubonic plague, right? Where that comes in, kills about a third of Europeans and maybe a quarter of West Africans.
Is this all because it spreads so easily from person to person because we don't have that genetic diversity from the bottleneck of earlier on?
Very likely, yeah. And it's
Right.
also, it spreads these really deadly diseases like your smallpoxes as well as your bubonic plagues. They're zoological vectors.
What does that mean?
Animals.
Okay.
Animals can spread them. So what the Spanish would do in North America is they would often release pigs and horses. Not as a weapon, but basically to say, okay, if we're stranded here, there'll be pigs that we can eat, or we can go out and we can catch these horses if we need them in the future.
Mm-hmm.
But what ends up happening is this spreads Eurasian, Afro-Eurasian diseases that the indigenous had no exposure to. And similar with the bubonic plague, of course, it's spread by the fleas on rats, which spreads out of China, through the Near East and then into Europe and West Africa. So, in terms of these ecological baselines, it's almost there's a type of almost offense or colonial, maybe bias, maybe supremacy. I don't know the exact term you'd want to use. These are very loaded terms, but if we say, oh, the pristine North America is North America of 1820, that's not an America, that's not an ecology that can sustain human life, right? And for two, that's almost like saying, the best version of the environment is one where all the indigenous people die. Like there's an ignorance and almost there's a very uncomfortable bias in there that I think a lot of people who just approach biology and biological norms from a pure science perspective, if you don't take into account that, that's after 90% of human occupants died.
Yeah. And I feel like...
Does that sort of make sense?
No, it does. And I think, too, for the climate of the planet, it seems...
Oh, it's changed, absolutely.
Yeah, it's changed, and we're very... we're changed. The climate... The planet's going to be fine, no matter what. It's been here for billions of years. Yep. If we're dead, the planet will rebound. So it seems like we're very... selfish, saying this climate, it's not going to be sustainable for us anymore.
Right.
Exactly. We're not going to be able to live here.
Exactly.
The planet will be fine, which I think is kind of funny too.
No, I love that. Thank you so much for bringing that up, James. That's something that I always stress when I'm teaching these topics. I am not an environmentalist, an ecologist. I'm not, a green person because I'm anti-human, right? I think so much damage has been done to the movement by these, rather radical sort of Looney Tune people who are partying in the street and they're death to humanity, humans a plague. No, because exactly like you said, the earth is going to be fine. I am an environmentalist because I care about humans, because we need a certain kind of climate to thrive and to survive. Even in a history, which is more of what I study of contact and colonization and violence and everything else in North America and exchange, right? That has gone through two or three great climatological periods that are not anthropogenic, right? The medieval warm period allows the Norse to settle in Greenland and to settle in North America, right? We know they made it at least to Newfoundland, likely potentially even to Maine or the Maritimes, right? So that's because of the medieval warm period, because you have less glaciation, as well as the Little Ice Age, right? So when the Spanish first arrived in Texas, the Rio Bravo actually froze over some of those early winters. Just to give you an idea of how different the climate was, I think this, not when they first arrived, but 17th century, right? You have this rise of the Little Ice Age at the end of the medieval warm period. That's very different world from what we inhabit today. So that's, three just already different climatological worlds that we live in. And we cannot try to preserve a climate of the medieval warm period because that's not where we are. We cannot try to preserve a climate of the Little Ice Age because that's not where we are. We need to find a way to be ecological while also respecting, what is beyond our control. Sure, okay, don't burn all these fossil fuels. Let's try to divest from India and China where they're still doing this coal and oil. But also, let's not delude ourselves into thinking that the world never changes, right? The world always fluctuates. Not these big jumps that we've seen in our lifetime, but there's always a fluctuation, right? There's a danger in saying, this is how the climate was when Lewis and Clark explored, and that's the perfect climate, and screw you if you think otherwise, right?
Yeah. So it sounds like we just need to be willing to adapt with the environment, but fix our footprint on it.
Absolutely.
Because we are really screwing it over.
Yeah, no.
So what do you think about this interplanetary travel, like colonizing Mars and this kind of stuff? Like if there's life forms on other planets, like just bacteria, whatever, do you think it's ethical to colonize another planet that already has some form of life on it?
I do, personally. I do not see bacteria as equal to, say, when the Japanese colonized Korea and they oppressed all these, indigenous Koreans, I don't see humans treading on interstellar bacteria in the same way, right? I definitely have, and maybe this is because of my own faith tradition and background, but I definitely do see humans as, my question with space colonization and exploration is, how will this affect humans? How will this affect our ecologies here? How can this be equitable? How can this be something that is at even some degree shared across ethnic, religious, and social classes? I think these questions of extraplanetary bacteria and alien life are valid questions to ask. But for my biases, they are not the first questions that concern me. I think if we need to make a little preserve on Mars and say this is the Martian bacteria and you can only see them with a microscope and they live in this 12-acre thing. Yeah. That's fine. We can. I'm more worried. How do we make it so it's not Elon Musk's? And I do like Elon Musk. I'm not even saying that. But how do we make it so it's not his personal fiefdom on Mars? How do we make it so it's
everyone's?
Jeff Bezos takes off and the 1,200 richest people who probably polluted this planet are able to get away, and we're just SOL.
Yeah, it makes sense because
that's the more pressing. And I'm not anti-space exploration or anti-colonization at all. I just think it needs to be something that, if we look at historic exploration and colonization, whether that's Inuit, whether that's Nordic, Gaelic, East Asian, right, with Zhonghe, there is always a cross-class, cross-cultural element to it. Yeah. And right now, we do not see that in space colonization.
So how does it usually work for colonization in the past? Does it usually like a stronger group comes and just wipes out everyone, or do they try to integrate them to their side?
Yeah, so generally so Matthew Johnson, who's an archaeologist of the classical world, has written a great sort of study on this, which I'm going to draw from. In his mind, there are two major forms of this. There is a Greek form, which he's sort of treated as a normative Greek form, like Phocia, right? The Phocian colonization, which settles Marseille, right? For example.
I have not.
Let's back it up. Let's just say he's made two normative forms, one which is Greek and one which is Roman. Okay. Right. So we'll just keep it at that.
Simple.
Yeah. No, it's not really important otherwise. Okay. So he basically argues in this one form, colonies are set up that are very insular. They generally colonized the Greeks on islands, and they said, the Greeks are superior. We're the best culture. We'll trade with the indigenous. We'll trade with, I'm obviously Gaelic descent, so my ancestors, the barbarians, we'll trade with the barbarians. But this is a Greek city-state that happens to be in a foreign land. Okay. And we see that, for example, in this continent with the English, right? When the English and later the British colonized New England and the rest of the eastern seaboard, it was colonized by families, right? It was whole family units that essentially set down a plot and said, this is New England. This is for Anglo-Saxons, this is for our religion, our culture, and, maybe we ally with some Indians, but mostly we just push them out. And you can contrast that with no, it's not Johnson. It's Steitler, actually, who's made this Yeah, my apologies. But you can contrast with what Dietler describes as the Roman system, which is much more about an integrationist, right? It's this idea, we'll settle some men, some soldiers, and they'll interbreed with the indigenous, and then there's this sort of hybrid culture that tends towards the imperial power for sure, but also brings in much more indigenous elements. We see that in how the Spanish colonize, right? Where they say, okay, you're going to be Spanish, but biologically you're mixed with, Spanish soldiers and indigenous women. Or even the French, right? Where you say, okay, you're an allied tribe, we'll convert you to Catholicism, and then you can just kind of do whatever you want so long as you join us in war and you practice the true faith. So those are sort of how it's happened in the past. Either it's been just a pure plunk down this group that's very insular, and obviously it doesn't stay insular, right? We look at Marseille, the example I used. Those Greeks began bathing, they began wearing their hair back in braids, and obviously they adopt these Gaelic traditions, but they're in their minds, they're saying, oh no, we're just Greek. We don't.
Yeah.
Oh, there's this Roman tradition which says, well, everyone can join, you need to follow the authority, you need to follow the empire. It's still oppressive, it's still exploitative. But there is a method of integration. Does that kind of make sense?
No, that makes a lot of sense.
So that we won't see that in space, for example, right?
Yeah.
There's no little Martians to marry off our women to, right?
Yeah. That's fair. So,
I know I kind of got rambly.
No. I like it. I'm just trying to, for colonization, it doesn't really seem like it goes over well most of the time for whoever's there before.
No.
So, do you think we should just like stay away from where people already are on Earth? Or because the combining of cultures does seem very beneficial. Like when you take the best of your culture with the best of ours and then you combine them a little bit, but sometimes the people don't want that.
Yeah.
So I'm curious if there is any good ways of, I don't like the word colonizing because that makes it seem like you're just going in and making it your own.
Yeah.
But I guess integrating would be a better way of doing it. So is there any benefit of like any good way to combine two cultures like that?
So, what we see a lot of times with these struggles is exactly that. It's sort of like, remember when we talked about early civilization, early state building, early agriculture, where from a historicizing point of view, from a top-down perspective, it does look wonderful, right? That's the American mythos, the melting pot, right? But it really is hard to distinguish if you're looking at socioeconomic status, if you're looking at power, if you're looking at exploitation. It often is hard to distinguish imperialism and what we would call today multiculturalism, right? It's no accident that Britain and France, who sort of had led this idea of, oh, we need to integrate society and take the best from everyone and anyone can immigrate. It's no accident that those are two of the largest colonial powers in history. It's no accident that the same wealthy bankers in France and, in Paris and in London, that and New York City, these same wealthy bankers and capitalists who once, exploited a global empire of, Pakistanis and West Africans and Muslims, now they do the same thing. It's just in one single country, right?
Yeah.
There's, there really is a challenge, right? We can look at what we call sort of multicultural, quote unquote, multilingual societies today, and they often do tend to be a bit more authoritarian or autocratic. Or we can even look at a country that we think is very wealthy, very, privileged in a lot of ways, like Belgium. And yet if we look at Belgian politics, they are completely split between the French-speaking Walloons and the Dutch-speaking Flemish. A lot of, there's these economic angles of, well, the Walloons used to be the wealthy ones, the monarchy speaks French, but the Flemish became wealthy during industrialization, and now industrialization is left and they're a little more poor. And, unfortunately that plays out in any of these sort of multicultural experiments. Even somewhere like the United States, right? You have, we take great pride, and perhaps rightly so, for being so integrationist, right? You and I, we're speaking the same languages despite the fact that our, great-grandfathers probably wouldn't have been able to.
Yeah.
There's this idea of a white America that's merged all these cultures and a black America that's merged all these cultures, and now, a Hispanic American culture that's merged dozens of countries and ethnic groups. But there's also an element that you do lose something in doing that, right? There is a difference between, saying that I'm maybe Irish American versus being, a really indigenous Irish deep sort of heritage, or, I think we really see it with, at least in my hometown, with people who are, Hispanic American versus people who are coming from a very specific Latin American, like we are DR, we are Catholic, we are Mestizo, and this is our culture, versus a more genericized. So that is a danger of that multicultural. And that's not even getting into, the exploitation angle, right? So I don't want to bring up, Bezos again too much to harp on him, but there was just a big controversy a few months ago where he's admitted to bringing in more immigrant labor because it makes it harder to organize
unions.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And we see this tragically in our own history, where Black Americans, after being freed from slavery, are often brought to union towns in Pennsylvania, in the Midwest, and they're basically forced into these communities to use as scab labor, right? The idea is, okay, Irish, Italian, German immigrants, they're going to unionize, so we'll just bring in these black laborers, and that'll sort of crush the unionization. And that's obviously not to blame the black labor, right?
Yeah.
They're just doing what's best for them.
They don't really have another choice.
No, exactly. And so that's just sort of the danger of these multicultural experiments, is that when you're not able to unify and to have a strong community, it's a catch-22, right? If you don't unify, you won't have a strong community, and you can be easily exploited, right? Divide and conquer.
Yeah.
It's a classic. But the other hand is, if you can form a strong unity, right? Look at, black identity, white identity, Hispanic identity. If you can form a strong community, you're giving up elements of what make you who you are.
Yeah. I find it...
Does that sort of make sense?
No, it makes a lot of sense. And I think of it, because I want to get to a point, I don't know if it'll ever be in my lifetime, where it doesn't matter where you come from, because at the end of the day, we're all just humans.
Right.
So it's like I'm Italian, I'm Irish and Scottish. Like, I love my Italian heritage, my Scottish heritage. I'm Cunningham. You got the over fork over. My little unicorn as our emblem or whatever.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah, of course I'd have a unicorn as my emblem.
It's very Scottish.
Yeah, right? So, but at the end of the day, like, we all started from the same spot, from those dozens of women.
Yes, yeah.
And just based on the location we adapted to either our melatonin make us darker or make us lighter, or different languages based on where we were. And I think it's so silly it makes sense. Like, I get it. Like, we all have community, people that are like us. We feel comfortable. But I feel like there'd be so much less problems if we could all just scrap that stuff and just say, hey, we're all the same. Like, we may come from different places, but let's just get along. And I don't know if we can get to that point without another worldly creature coming down and being, oh shit, let's unify, because that thing's way different than all of us.
Right. Yeah, no, that's, you touch on a really important thing in human thought, right? Is that all, or most, if not all, identities are reflexive, right? They're formed in a dialogue. I am male because I am not female, right? I am American because I am not whatever this foreign thing is, right? We are, you're Catholic because you're not Jewish in the early church, right? So we always have to form these dialectics, which is exactly right. How do you form a unified humanity unless there's this other to say, well, you are human because you are not AI, or you're not alien, or you're not whatever. The one danger, though, that I caution, because I agree that's a very idyllic worldview, and there's, of course, I don't think anyone is pro-racism or pro-bigotry, but there's a danger in that when we say, okay, we all need to be this normative thing, there is a danger of erasure from assimilation. So when we look at the Marxist regimes of the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China, which is, of course, still ongoing today, they had very similar ideals to that. They said, oh, we need to liberate these people. We need to, bring feminism to the women, and we need to stop, all this ethnic struggling and everything else. But when that actually became acted out in policy, it results in genocide, like the Holodomor, and like what's going on in East Turkestan today with the Uyghurs.
I don't get how no one's doing anything about that kind of stuff.
No, I know. and it also results in an implicit bias that whoever is in power to say, we need to all come together and sing Kumbaya and adopt these norms, it's funny how it always seems to be their norms, right?
Yeah.
It's Moscow culture that the Muslims of Central Asia need to learn, or it's Han Mandarin that the Uyghurs need to learn, or the Tibetans need to learn.
Yeah.
Right? So it's very hard to say, how can the world come together that'll inherently privilege a certain type of culture? Even look at today, right, in Afghanistan. The United States spent 20 years, quote unquote, spreading democracy, spreading liberal capital, liberalism, and within a couple of months, the Afghani people said, actually, no, we don't want this. We never wanted this. This is not in our culture. This is not our heritage. We want to do things our own way. And, and I know myself and many other people have lost friends and mentors who've died, in a war that really was so senseless because, as nice as that worldview is, that we should all unify around a single humanity, in practice, there is an almost neo-imperialistic element to that. And that's not meant as an accusation.
No, yeah, no.
But it's a sort of reality when you put that onto the ground.
Yeah.
They don't want to let women vote. They don't want to let them drive. They, to use a very extreme example.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think there could be a way where we all keep our differences and our identities, but with still the underlying thing of, hey, you could do what you're doing over there. I'll do what I'm doing over here. You're good.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I
But,
think that would be wonderful.
There has to be natural laws.
Yeah, of course.
Which I don't think we even know yet.
Right.
But
right.
there, I think we can pretty much agree. Well, I guess there is places that like murder is like used as like sacrifices and stuff.
Right. And that's the danger, right? It's that everyone can agree that murder is wrong, but how do we agree on what is murder? So, for me, in my opinion, okay, I think that honor killing, if you kill your daughter because she had sex before marriage, I think that's murder. I think it's wrong. I think abortion is murder. I think that's wrong. But on the other hand, I'm okay with the concept of war in theory, right? That if we need to defend our country, you can go and get. But other people would say, no, war is always murder, even if it's a just war. And these are the concepts, right? I do agree with the church. I agree with Aristotle that there are these natural laws, but it's these minute, and that's where I think anthropology excels, in finding these minute problems that say, how are we defining murder?
Yeah.
Right? How are we defining, and historically the Catholic Church, one thing that I find very admirable about the church, especially in the New World, is that for a very long time they were much better than the Protestant church or even the Orthodox churches at separating the religious from the cultural. They could say, hey, you can still be Haudenosaunee, you can still be Abenaki, you can still be French, you can still be Spanish, so long as you accept this worship practice.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that that's maybe the future of the world in general, but there are frameworks for exactly what you're suggesting, that we agree on certain things,
but that's hard to do.
It's hard to do.
And that's where I'm like, we're one species across this world, maybe two worlds kind of soon.
Right.
Like, how do we all work together to just because I feel like I could say safely everyone wants to have a good, happy, content life.
Sure.
So how do we all, because I feel like we need government. We need some laws in order to say, hey, you can't encroach on someone else's pursuit of happiness. And it's like, how, because I think you're spot on when you're saying earlier, we need like smaller communities. Then it's just, I feel like we need a shift in something, and it's probably not going to happen in our lifetimes.
No.
Because nothing's going to shift in our lifetime. But we need something to change. But I'm also curious to hear, I think I might have asked you this in class, about what separates us from animals.
Yeah.
because I mean, like in Latin, like animal is just like living thing, like animal,
Right.
and like because we kind of just are an animal. So
Yeah, 100%. Yep.
the fact, I don't know, one of my people I've had on the podcast who's he was my calculus teacher, worked at NASA.
Oh wow.
He was like this genius. He quit NASA because it was he said it was unethical. They're unethical over there, so he
That's
quit.
fascinating.
So I was like, oh, okay.
Yeah. Ooh.
But he thinks it's like these transcendent moments that we have, like when we can listen to music or read a book, stuff like that, have a deep conversation.
Yeah.
Like these transcendent moments, like other animals can't have that.
Yeah.
So I wonder if it's because of comes from our brain. The more, I mean, some people try to link, I don't know how much research they have on it, but the amount of neurons you have compared to the consciousness you have. Because I feel like there's different levels of consciousness. Like we think of humans as the top, like we think dolphins are pretty up there, whales, elephants, dogs are a little lower, and then you got like cows, pigs, chickens, and then even lower, like insects and ticks and bacteria and all down the line and down to like single-celled organisms. So I'm kind of just curious about your perspective on like what, if there even is a difference between us and these creatures.
No, I definitely agree with your former calculus teacher then. There is, on a fundamental biological level, we are animals, right? We are under that Animalia tree. We are under that primate, hominidae family. But the reason that I do feel comfortable privileging the human in my studies, privileging the human in my interactions and in my value system, of course, there are a million spiritual reasons, right? Any sort of spirituality that you draw from, there is generally some uniqueness about the human, right? Even if you're a more animistic, where everything has a spirit and everything has a soul, these people aren't sociopaths. They don't privilege, the soul of the rock is more important than the soul of my sister. No, there's a value in interconnectedness that I totally agree with, but there's never been a culture that's unprivileged the human on a metaphysical level. Yeah. Right. Even if you say, okay, the human is interconnected, it's still a human that's saying it. Yeah. Right? I think there's a great deal of metaphysical and spiritual reasons to that, but from a purely biological perspective, the amount of neurons, but more so a density, right? So a whale has a bigger brain, but it's far less dense. There's far more body for it to control, as well as the organization, the structure of our brains are quite complex and quite unique, right? It's not just that you could string all these neurons together arbitrarily and make something as intelligent or as complex. We have an object permanence that's incredibly rare in the animal world. We can remember things that are not physically in front of us. If I hide this water cup below the table, you don't think it disappears. Yeah,
but like our babies do.
Right, exactly. and again, I'm talking about a neuroatypical human, or a neurotypical human, excuse me. So there are obviously humans that are still biologically human and have all the rights that we should enjoy, who may not think the same way that we do, but there's that biological basis. But no, in terms of, it's object versus, it's language, it's theoretical concepts, to draw from Weber again, this idea of a religion, right? This idea that I really do think it's only humans that will sacrifice ourselves for something that does not have any immediate biological payoff. Yeah. Right? Whether that's a martyr for a god or even someone who's, a soldier or a fireman. Look at a fireman, right? Even if they're not religious, they've had some type of civil religion. They have some type of belief in a humanity larger than themselves, because they'll run into a burning building to save someone with no genetic relation to them. Yeah. And that's not something other animals will do.
And that doesn't make sense, because people like, it's just your genes want to get passed on. So that does not make sense at all.
Exactly. And I think that's uniquely human of us, these complex ideas that we are able to form and to understand. And obviously there's the simple stuff. Tool use is very rare in the animal kingdom. Yeah. So I think when you put all of these together, in my mind, along with the physical, biological reality of being human, that to me makes us this special, certainly an animal, but a special animal.
Yeah. Do you think there could be any other special animals that emerge? Because I see like some primates are using like tools now and like the spears. Yeah. And I'm like, oh my gosh, are they in their stone age right now?
I would argue that other primates are, if we're taking this from a purely biological point of view, right? So obviously religiously, I definitely privilege the human as well as an image of God, right? And an ensouled being. But if you're taking a purely biological view, I still think it would be rare for another primate, because you have to remember the randomness of mutation,
true.
right? We really haven't been around that long as a thinking, intelligent animal.
Yeah.
It could be a very real truth that actually intelligence is not an adaptational advantage, right? I mean, you said it yourself.
Yeah.
How have we done to the planet? How good is this intelligence if we spread for a few thousand years and then we die off? So I do think a lot of these primates are so well adapted to their niche. I don't know if they're going to have the biological pressure to adapt, to mirror human evolution. You want to know what I think? If you snapped your fingers, all humans are gone. I put my money on the octopus.
They're smart.
If you get an octopus that does not die after giving birth, after having offspring, if you are able to get an octopus that can train its young, that can pass on information, maybe that's the animal that develops some kind of intellect. But that's just a hypothetical. Or if you're looking on another planet, whatever, that
would be an interesting mutation if they would survive after death. Because I don't know if you watch
after birth.
Survive
after death would be pretty interesting.
That would
be
pretty cool.
Yeah.
But did you watch My Octopus Teacher? It was like a documentary. No. This guy would go into the water, and like hang out with this octopus every day for like a very long. I think it was like a few years or something, like maybe 2 years. And at first it was scared of it, and then it started using him as like a hunting tool. So it would go behind lobsters and use him as a base, so it couldn't escape this way, and then it would like pounce on it to get the food, because if it wasn't there, then it would just flee that way. And it was so interesting. It would like latch onto him, and it would know when it would come. It was just those things are so cool, and they'd open the jars to get the food.
Yes, and use the coconut shells. They're so brilliant.
They're
absolutely
genius. And they camouflage. Like they're so smart.
I don't know if you've ever saw it. It might be a little before your time. But it was a British program from the 90s called, like, it was the Wild series. So like walking with dinosaurs, walking with monsters. And they did one called The Future is Wild. And that was their prediction, was that basically the assumption was, okay, humans leave the planet, we all colonize somewhere else, what happens on Earth? And their sort of long-term vision was, eventually the octopus becomes not human equivalent, but becomes intelligent, basically.
That's wild. Oh my gosh.
Yeah, there's the tagline. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, no.
That's really cool. What time is it here? 1:47.
Okay.
Would you like to discuss anything else, or I don't know if you need to be anywhere?
No, I don't need to be anywhere. If you have any other questions you want to get me even to.
No, okay. I like that. I didn't want to see if I was keeping you too long.
No. I think that'll be fine. Yeah.
All right, cool. So then where do you think humans give us another however many hundreds of thousands of years? Like, what direction do you think we're going in?
Is that think or hope, perhaps?
Well, we can go two ways.
Yeah.
We'll go with hope first and then think.
I mean, what I would hope is that we... in some ways, what I hope is almost that there's just something that I can't predict, right? I mean, certainly I hope, we retain a spiritualism, we retain a salvation, but, technologically, I can almost imagine that there's infinitely... When I look up at the night sky at night, I always feel so inspired because in my cosmology, my personal view, and I think the view of a lot of other folks, is that when I look up at the stars at night, I see millions and billions of galaxies, trillions of planets, and I think that we have a creator that trusted us enough to make all of that space for us. That whatever BS we're dealing with on this planet, that if we can get our act together, we can go up there and we can settle that and live in that and explore it and respect it and steward it. We just need to get all this mess sorted out here.
Yeah.
But on a more maybe realistic, a more pessimistic note, I worry that what we're seeing today, I see three big challenges that may be a collapse. The environmental, which I'm sure we've talked about and other people are well aware of. I see definitely an ethnic tensions rising, just because there's this myth that we're living in a postmodern world and truth is now relative. Truth has always been relative to people, right? I mean, we can say there's an objective truth, but people have always thought truth was relative. We've always only had a piece of the truth.
Yeah.
But now we're jamming all those people together. That's the new issue, right? It's not, it used to be, okay, you live in Australia, you believe this one thing, I believe something else in Europe, I'm never going to see you in my life. But now we're being forced together, right? You have native people who are dealing with mass migrations, and they're saying, well, these people are depressing my labor, they're suppressing my vote, they're marginalizing our culture that we built. And you have these displaced people who are saying, we cannot stay in our home due to war, because your country invaded it, because your capitalists are exploiting it. So, both sides totally valid grievances, but push them together.
Yeah, causes conflict.
Yeah. And of course the economic 3 E's. I like, for my class, I like things that are triangular. I like things that are alliterative. Then the economic, right? We have such a degree of economic inequality. And that is something that no society has ever really, when it passes a certain level, it becomes dangerous, because those with economic, and that's whether we're saying capitalists like in the West or Marxists like in China, when you have an elite group that has so much wealth and so much power, they become more concerned. I see this in my research into the French kingdom in like the 18th century. They become so concerned with preserving their wealth and preserving their status and playing their games that they forget the objective things they need to do, right? They forget how to say, how do we make sure the peasants have food? And we're the peasants in that. Yeah. How do we make sure that, the army is still functioning? How do we make sure that the trade routes are still running? How do we make sure that they're, the belief system is still strong? The danger is when some people get so wealthy, they get so, as a culture, they get so enraptured in these games. What I worry, if we're talking hundreds of years in the future, what I almost worry is that we're looking at another Bronze Age collapse.
Fun.
Right? That our trade lines are so interconnected. I mean, look at what we've just experienced in the past 2 years. Yeah. Right? Imagine this with a disease that has a higher death rate or, higher mortality rate.
We're done.
Yeah. At least in the way that we conceptualize civilization today, right? There's also the democratization of violence. In the Bronze Age, this was iron. Right? To smelt bronze, you need these huge trade routes. You need to bring in tin from across the world. You needed to be a state to have an army. Once we develop the technology to smelt iron, any of these, what we might call sort of blithely, hill people, they would have called them barbarians or sea peoples. They could now have better weapons than those in power. And we look at 100 years ago. The British Empire, they expand because of the steamboat, the telegraph, modern medicine, same with the French, right? Finally penetrating Africa, as finally in quotes, right? Yeah. But they also do that because of weapons. The Maxim machine gun. Yeah. You can't build a Maxim machine gun in your garage in the 1900s. Yeah. But someone was just arrested in Germany for this just a couple weeks ago. You can now 3D print firearms. And that's only going to become more advanced. Look at drones, right? Drone technology. You can take down a fighter jet while it's taking off just by ramming a drone into it, right? We have this democratization of violence that when you mix that with economic inequality, ethnic strife, and ecological collapse, and you throw in democratization of violence, that is not a stable society to live in. Yeah, we need to address these systemic issues, but I worry that those in power are going to be too busy suppressing the democratization of violence, which can only ever be a stopgap, right? You can never out-legislate innovation in that sense.
What happened in the past when all this stuff came to a climax? Because it seems like we're reaching that point again. So, what happened? Was it in France where this was happening? Or?
So in the 1700s in France, you get the French Revolution, right, which is bloody, which is horrific. You see genocides across the country of the Bretons. You see the suppression of the Catholic Church. You see war raged against the rest of Europe. But that's only a national collapse. What I'm proposing here, what I'm worried about, what legitimately scares me, other than AI, is what legitimately scares me is I'm talking about a systemic collapse, not a national collapse.
Okay.
That's something like in the Bronze Age, right? So these are civilizations before the Greeks, before the Romans, even before the Qin in China. We're talking, no, not before the Qin, but so maybe contemporary with the Shang. We're talking very, very long back in history. We're talking Babylonians, Assyrians, Egyptians.
Mm-hmm.
What you see when the system collapsed, it's first of all, it's every one of these imperial autocratic states collapses, except for Egypt. They just shrink. Writings disappear because the only people who knew how to write,
they're gone.
They're gone, exactly. Life goes back to being far, far more localized, far more simplified. You get entirely new ethnic makeups as these, invaders, migrants, whatever you want to call them, sweep through these kingdoms and displace people. You get new religions. You get... So the Trojan War, for example, is a narrative that is written during the Bronze Age collapse and is told as it's not written, it's told as an oral history during the Bronze Age collapse. So what do we hear in that story, right? We hear these massive armies that invade a kingdom that was built on trade, and they sack it and they burn it to the ground. Even to this day, we cannot translate linear, I believe it's linear A. We do not have a translation. So there's all this knowledge that's just erased. It's called the Dark Age, right?
Yeah.
And that's not... Historically, that was a value judgment term. Today it's not used to refer to, say, the early Middle Ages because they're still writing.
Okay.
Right? So it's not necessarily a dark age. It's just not what we imagine as advanced.
Yeah.
But the Bronze Age collapse, that does lead to a dark age because we do not know what's going on. And let me tell you something. I mean, James, you might be more advanced than a lot of folk in this, but, if I gave you a machinist shop, could you remake your MacBook?
0%. No.
I mean, or even let's just make it a little simpler. If I gave you an empty MacBook with no OS, could you code it for me?
No.
No, exactly.
No.
Exactly. And that's the reality. I'm actually working on a bit of a theoretical article on this, just on a very minor level. But what is it like to live in a digital dark age? And I might say that again, not a value judgment, but it's essentially saying, hey, say you're probably too young for this actually, but say my family took all my home videos on Betamax. How can I watch those?
I don't think you can.
Exactly.
You bring it to a shop.
Right, and you hope.
Yeah.
And obviously that's a very cutesy example, but it's a real problem in my field where there is some incredible data from great, excellent excavations done perfectly scientifically, the best of their time. And these people, they were so smart, they said, we're going to use floppy disks to save them because we're advanced. We're going to use the floppy disk. It'll be saved forever. It won't be degrading on paper. How do I play that floppy disk?
Yeah.
And you can, but can you in 50 years? If my son's an archaeologist, can he read that floppy disk? And even paper, right? Paper is so much easier to destroy. You need to replace paper. I think it's something like every 150, 200 years, you need to retranscribe all that stuff unless it's, preserved like that thing on the wall there.
Yeah.
So there's this very real question of, will the time that we're living in, and this is how I want people to conceptualize, even if you don't get a collapse, will this be a dark age? Right? All this stuff we're saving to the Google Cloud.
Yeah.
What happens if Google says, actually, this isn't profitable and wipes it? Gamers, video games, they talk about this a lot. There are NES games that you just cannot play anymore. The cartridges have corroded. Even if you found an NES, they were never uploaded. They weren't cult classics. They weren't Legend of Zelda, whatever. So you have all this knowledge and that's obviously a very petty example. It's a very fun example.
Yeah, but you could take this to a larger scale.
Exactly.
And that's what it makes me think.
And you throw collapse on top of that. You say, well, what if this system doesn't exist? And we're not writing stuff on stone anymore?
Yeah.
That is a recipe for a dark age. So those are sort of there's my hopeful optimist, but I also worry about, continuing these trends and we get the AI, we get sort of exploited in that way, or, we face total systemic collapse and
it feels like
lose
it's the
so
latter.
much. Yeah.
It really does. Because do you think this could have happened in the past? Because it doesn't seem like no matter what we could do, we can't preserve our knowledge. Like, because we had the Library of Alexandria, where all these people brought their books.
Had their books taken from them.
That too?
Yeah, it's an exploitative system. Yeah.
Tough.
Yeah.
So had their books taken from them and brought here.
Yeah.
and they're like, all our knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
And then it burns to the ground and all this knowledge is lost.
Mm-hmm.
And then like what you said, we have all our knowledge in the cloud. I don't even know where the stuff's stored.
Yeah.
It's somewhere.
It's Alexandria near DC.
Yeah. Oh, is it actually called? No, it's not. It's called Alexandria.
It's
where the stuff's stored?
Oh, it's the city in Virginia. It's Alexandria. Yeah.
Wow. Did they do that on purpose?
I don't know. You'd have to ask Bezos. I don't know.
That has to be on purpose.
I think the city predates the data storage.
I know, but still. That's kind of funny.
That is a bit unsettling.
That is a little
I never
unsettling.
noticed that.
That's weird. Yeah, history, like Mark Twain says, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes.
No, it's Marx.
Oh, that was Marx?
Yeah.
Oh, even better. So that's just
Wow.
that's yeah. That's oh my gosh.
Maybe they both said it. Who the hell knows?
Oh. Now I'm really sold that everything's going to collapse again and we're going to lose everything.
Yeah,
Jeez.
I think in terms of in the past, right, we've definitely these systemic collapses, a lot of theory, world systems theory, and others, argue that these cycles do repeat, right? Leslie White, who we talked about in class back a year ago, he argues that these cycles repeat due to energy. Some people say due to economics, due to ecology. What I would caution is that a society as advanced as we are has almost certainly never existed on this planet.
Fair.
Because we have done certain things that will last functionally forever. Not literally, but for example, nuclear power, nuclear explosions. These have left a residue on the earth that was not here before. Even stuff that's very simple like glass. Even the people who are very advanced, Göbekli Tepe, they did not have glass because we would have recovered that. Right? So are there complex civilizations that we probably do not know about? Yes. But we need to be very cautious that complex means class differentiation and long-distance trade and intellectualism, not podcasts and automobiles, right? That's the one thing I will caution, because I love this idea of a deep history, of an almost Lovecraftian, antediluvian world, but we need to be very clear about what we're expecting, right? When we say advanced, it's Neolithic, Paleolithic complexity. It's not supercomputers. And to the Library of Alexandria example, one thing that we need to bear in mind with that, not to disagree on the central premise, but it's actually, history is rarely these single events. What actually occurs in Alexandria is the library is burned multiple times. First by Julius Caesar, and later by Christian riots, later by Islamic conquest.
People love burning books.
People do.
It's so stupid.
Well, and again, though, the Library of Alexandria is an imperialistic tool. It is a tool of oppression. So it's not necessarily just burned because books bad. It's not like the Nazis, right? It's not like the Soviets. Often it's burned because you have exploited the knowledge of my people.
Oh, okay.
But the reason I bring it up, not just I'm not justifying it, right?
Yeah.
Surely it's clearly an objective loss for humanity. We have lost so much knowledge from that in terms of history and philosophy. But it's not just the burnings. It's also that the dynasties who ruled Alexandria, the Ptolemies and then the Romans, they stopped investing in the library. A lot of those books, of course, they're lost during fires, they're lost during burnings. But a lot more are just lost due to decay.
Yeah,
they're
they
just
transcribe them again.
Exactly. So that's again, it's not to minimize the burnings or minimize anything like that, but it's just a reminder that if we want to save what we know for posterity, it's not about stopping, one madman with a torch. Sometimes it is. Sometimes maybe it is, right? There's a gentleman in Iraq, a very famous Iraqi scholar, who actually did that. He took out all of these artifacts and all of these books before the American invasion, which destroyed that library because the Iraqis put air defense stuff on top of it. So sometimes you can be that hero. You can be that single individual hero, and that's wonderful. But a lot of times these are systems, right? We need to find ways to back up this data. We need to find ways to spread this knowledge, to preserve things in our own lives, and to advocate for systems which do preserve knowledge.
Yeah, because it seems like we're a species with amnesia. I've heard a lot.
Oh, I love that. That's quite,
Yeah,
no, that's quite evocative. I do like that.
It is a nice, I can't claim it for myself. I've heard someone say it before, but it resonates.
Yeah.
Because we do forget a lot of our
absolutely.
past. And that's why everyone always says history repeats itself. It's just we keep making the same mistakes.
Right.
There's this great quote, I forgot who said it, but it was like, we learn from history that we don't learn from history.
Oh,
which
that
I
is
think
cute.
so
Yeah.
funny because
Yeah.
we just keep making the same mistakes. And it's like the only way we can move forward, at least from my perspective, is that we know our past. Because if you know your past, then you're not going to make the same mistakes. Well, I would hope
Yeah.
that you don't
absolutely.
make the same mistakes.
I guess that's the catch, right? It's not just knowing these past events. It's also, and I think this is one, I'm not disagreeing with you at all.
No, you
I
can
think
disagree.
that's-
I love when people disagree.
No,
with me.
I do think that's true. I just want to take that next
Good.
step.
Please
it's
do.
not only knowing the past as like an objective list of dates and events, which is important, but it's also applying a lens that is correct.
Yeah.
Right? Because you could know the past, but if you, this is something I don't agree with a Marxist view of history. I don't agree with this idea that history is objectively going towards one single end. Right? That's why, I'm very ready to criticize capitalism and global capital, but I hate the phrasing late capital. Because who the heck are you to say that this is late capital? This could keep going on for another 200 years. You know what I mean? So it's not just knowing the history. We also need a framework that is a systemic framework, a theoretical framework that allows us to interpret that history correctly. Or not correctly, but in a predictive manner.
Yeah.
Right? I know, again, this is my nerdy side showing as much as anything else is. But The Foundation by Isaac Asimov, if you've read that.
I have not.
It's basically this idea that he writes this fictional space society, and a gentleman in that society knows all the history and knows all the science, and he writes a predictive model that says, okay, the empire is going to collapse, and I'm going to leave them a library to rebuild it, basically. And, it's obviously very dramatized science fiction, but in some ways, when we do study the past, that's at some level how we should be, right? Because simply knowing your history might not stop you from repeating it or from going through these same cycles. We need to know our history and know it through a lens that makes it actionable, which is another reason I really did switch from history to anthropology, archaeology.
More action.
I believe it's more actionable with these theoretical frameworks.
Yeah.
And that's not a shame on history. There are historians who are very much social historians.
So how do you see us in an ideal world keeping our knowledge and making it so we could use it in the future?
Yeah. There are some great projects that are being done in terms of biological knowledge with these seed banks in the Nordic countries and in Antarctica. There, I believe, are some systems in place to make to actually inscribe things in stone out. I think somewhere in the United.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, because that really is the reality, that stone lasts in a way that technology doesn't. And these are sort of big concepts, but on a minor scale, I think we need to advocate for more open and more, I say public, not necessarily to mean government, but some type of public upload of knowledge, of data, of this electronic data, right? The fact that even just things as silly as games and movies, they do need to be stored on some kind of framework that is continually upgraded and is separate from these exploitative power structures, just so that it won't be destroyed like Alexandria.
Yeah. I think that they're doing that. I think this is the funniest, craziest, awesomest, all real worlds words that I just used. But in Minecraft, who would have thought, you can go in places like China where it withhold information from people, and you can't get all these books, they're banned. There's a server in Minecraft where you can go, and all these books are written in the Minecraft books, so you could read them, which I think is so crazy to think. Who would have thought Minecraft, a game with blocks, is just going to help people in a different country that this information's banned in. So I think that's so cool.
Yeah, that's incredible. I mean, that goes back to what we were talking before about this Ladidic view of technology, that it's not inherently bad, but it needs to be used to advance humanity, to advance morality. That's such a great example. Yeah. I wasn't aware of that.
My friend told me about that. I'm like, wow, that's nuts. But I think the way we're going with virtual reality, I think this is going to be a real possibility. Because if you can put on this, have you seen Ready Player One or read it?
I'm familiar.
Okay, but Facebook's really making a thing right now where, well, it's just a virtual reality world, and you can go on roller coasters, you can go in meetings, create your own avatar, do all this kind of stuff. But I see it as an educational use.
Yeah, of course.
You put on a headset. It doesn't matter if you're in Africa, China, Antarctica. As long as you have a Wi-Fi connection, you can put on this headset, look like you're in this place, and learn from the best of the best. You don't need to go to colleges, pay $70,000. You could buy $100 headset, or hopefully donated. And you could learn just like anyone else. You don't even have to leave your home.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that's so wonderful. I think if we're talking about your original question about like preservation of data, we always need to remember that any of these technologies that are existing in a virtual space, they are still anchored to our real world, right?
Sure.
So those are servers, not if it's a live conversation, but that's not preserved, but say it's a recorded professor, that is going to be on a server bank somewhere. And that server bank, as we talked about, it needs to be upgraded, it needs to be protected. And, it is wonderful that Facebook is facilitating this. But
Kind
on
of
the other,
scares me because it's Facebook.
that's exactly what I was going to say. On the other hand, right, it is Zuckerberg. We know
his ethical problems that he's been having, especially with this whistleblower that's been coming out, just saying all this stuff.
And that's the danger of this new framework, is that we are seeing in the American context, we are seeing a conflict between two foundational principles, right? Private property and free expression. Because, it's Facebook's ownership, but should it be? Right?
Yeah.
Social media is an inherently monopolistic good. And in America, in a lot of industries, we've decided that monopolies are immoral, or that they should be run by the government, to be public, to be accountable. Because right now, Facebook or Reddit, whatever your politics are, Google, if they can ban, a certain president of the
United States, that is the most ridiculous thing. I don't care, I do care what he said, but all the stuff he says, just to think, you say to someone 10 years ago, 20 years ago, they're going to ban the president of the United States from all social media. Literally silencing his voice, and now they're saying on YouTube anything that goes against vaccines, they're slicing.
I found something, and I'm vaccinated, it's required by the job, but I did find something. I did the J&J. I found something that literally a channel was taken down because they were uploading clips of Fauci from 2 years ago. So it's literally no denying the science. It's not like some crackpot saying, vaccines ought to, whatever. It's literally just old science. Or one guy got, or I think it might have been a woman actually, but got, kicked off these social media for saying something that the CDC later agrees to, and UNESCO later agrees to. Not UNESCO, the WHO later agrees to. And it's one of these things that it's so dangerous when you give these unaccountable tech oligarchs this kind of power, because actually I was just talking about this with the father at my church earlier today. He was saying science should not be dogma. Science needs to be a dialogue, and you need to be able to follow leads and be ethical. But if you suppress a certain type of inquiry, or you suppress a certain point of view from even being expressed, to me, that's such it's not science in the way that I would like to practice science.
No, that's not how it should be at all. And philosophy is in the same light. You want people. That's why I love when people disagree with me, because then I can make my point stronger.
Yeah.
So
iron sharpens iron.
Exactly.
Right?
So when we just silence a side, no matter what it is, if it's right or wrong, if it's wrong, there's this great quote or similar or whatever. Like the truth is like a lion. If you release like something that's fake or false, the truth is going to obviously just tear it up, make it obvious that that's wrong. So why even question? Why would you even why would you silence something and literally instead of just letting the truth argue it?
Right.
Because if it's wrong, then it's wrong.
Yeah.
Why do you have to worry about it? Because if it's right, then if you could argue it with facts, theories, whatever, you could get to the bottom of it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a bit more cynical than you.
That's fair.
I don't fully embrace that, but what I would say is that when there is systematic failure, because I'm a systems guy, right? I think I'm a systems guy. When there is systematic failure, censorship is not a solution. it's a cover-up. It's a rug over the hole in the floor, right? Because we've seen this from historic regimes. We saw this in the Soviet Union, in their collapse. We saw this in the collapse of the Kingdom of France in the 18th century. And what we're seeing today, look at the people who are the lowest rate. And I'm not talking individuals. I'm talking groups, right? Like systems. Look at the groups that are the lowest vaccinated rate today. Do you know what they are?
Blacks.
Yeah. Black Americans and rural Trump voters, right? Yeah. What are these two groups? What do, rural working class whites and Black Americans, urban Americans, what do they share in common?
Distrust in the vaccine.
Well, right, but what I'm sorry, I feel like I'm in a lecture. I don't mean to.
No, I like when you. I like.
But like, what is? Think about it. Think about the rural American experience of the past, say, 20 years, and the Black American experience of the past. I mean, the whole thing, the whole Black American. Yeah. What does they share? Right. What is an organization that's been victimizing them? Think about the opioid crisis. Think about the Tuskegee experiments.
I don't know, oppression.
It's oppression, but it's they've been victimized, and they have legitimate distrust with the medical industry. The medical industry in this country a century ago and up until the 1960s and 70s treated blacks essentially as children. They did not get informed consent to conduct experiments. They would not treat them just to see how diseases would progress. They would use them as tests for, I think, some types of like biological, maybe not weapons, but biological technologies. It's exploitative, right? I understand why Black America does not trust Pfizer and Moderna and the CDC. And at the same time, this is a much more recent scarring. It's two groups can be oppressed without it being a competition. When we look at rural America, when we look at Appalachia, when we look at the heartland, when we look at the native sort of South, like American Southern population, those are the target, and working class American whites and Hispanics, those are the people targeted by the opioids.
Yeah.
The opioid crisis. It was pushed on people who did not have access to real medical care. They did not have access to physical therapy, for example. They could not take time off work because they did not have the labor rights to do that. And instead, they were given a pill. They were say, take this pill and you'll be better. And what do we see 30 years in the future, right? It is
carnage. I go to a small town in Kentucky every summer, and it's just sad. Yeah. It's the only word to say of just the carnage that the opiates, especially paired with the coal industry was there, and now the jobs are gone, and they have this thing that could take them away from all their pains. Not usually a good combo.
No, and of course, it's not just the medical industry. I don't mean to say that.
No, I don't like the medical industry.
But it's systems on top of systems. Yeah. But so many people are saying, oh, they just need to trust the science, or oh, they just need to believe the truth, whatever else. And it's like, yeah, and I do agree with the good science that's being done. But I can't fault people for not trusting corporations and government entities that have abused them for a generation in this white rural area and many generations in these Black communities. I think that's very different than the California middle-class mom who's rubbing crystals on her kid and says vaccines cause autism. There are these systematic reasons that people... So that's the one thing I will say. The truth may be a lion, but, sometimes that lion has some weights on its paws, or sometimes the truth... What is the truth? The gladiator in this situation? Sometimes the truth gets a spear and a sword, and other times, it's just out there buck naked.
Yeah, that's fair. So for the systems, it seems in the past, people say power corrupts all, or whatever. So the people that get to these positions, and we see it in like the Stanford prison experiment, when you give people power, they abuse it. And I don't know if this is just a human trait that when you get power, you just turn into a scumbag. But these people at the top...
Or are you always a scumbag and you just can't act on it?
Exactly. So I would say, what can we do to fix these systems to make it so it's fair for everyone? But then, just like when the bourgeoisie came into power, then they just oppressed the people below them.
Yeah.
There's literally a slave that got freed from being a slave, and then because of the time, if you want to be a successful businessman, you own slaves, and then he bought more slaves.
Yeah, that was an example from my class. It was John, one of General Washington's slaves, who escapes to Sierra Leone and becomes a slave owner there.
So it's can you even modify these systems to make it so there's no oppression or there's no, there's fairness from the top to the bottom,
Right.
which
I think we've been trying to do that for a very long time.
and I don't know. That's where I come back to philosophy. It's like we need the only way to figure that stuff out is like to figure your own stuff out.
Absolutely.
So I think that's why I think there needs to be a big educational push on the self. And like we need to teach how to be a good person, because if you can be a moral person, because I feel like there's so many ways to do wrong, but there's really only one way to do right.
Yeah, I mean that's that goes back. There's this Zoroastrian sort of idea that the pathway to heaven is this very narrow sort of walkway over pits of fire, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I agree with that. You need to a European thinker in the, I believe, 16th century, Erasmus. I'm sure you're familiar with. He was this big philosopher, and he sort of reduxes a lot of these Greco-Roman ideas of the noble ruler. Right, and this is one thing that I would argue when I see the Stanford Prison Experiment, when I see the French Republic, how they treated their soldiers in World War I, especially minority language soldiers. I would say there is a value in a republicanizing, right? So a more egalitarian, but not fully egalitarian, an idea of a noblesse obligée, right? It's this idea that if you are going to be in power, that power comes with. That you, first of all, you need a certain kind of knowledge to have power, right? That if we just, Stanford Prison Experiment, right? If we just give you power.
Or you're born into it.
Absolutely, right?
Marcus Aurelius' kid, or adopted kid, I guess.
Yeah, no, exactly. Or I think even a lot of these tech plutocrats, they're just some goober who has a startup in their basement, and 20 years later, they're massive players in the political sphere.
Mark Zuckerberg literally started Facebook as a dating app.
Exactly.
To get with girls in college.
Exactly. And I think that's so different. We see this, you mentioned, I love the example, right, of the bourgeois, right? The bourgeois in England and in France, they come to power as sort of, it's liberatory, it's breaking the monarchy, it's breaking these nobles, and yet these first generations are libertines. They don't know how to rule. They don't know how to respect people. And there's this myth, this deadly myth of meritocracy, where it's sort of like, I'm successful. If you're not, that's your problem, so I can exploit you.
That seems very American too.
Oh, it does. No, unfortunately, it is baked into an element of our DNA. There is that noblesse obligée as well, where you have, especially in the Northeast, where you don't have the slave labor as much, you see this idea of, these are farm leaders, they're community leaders, and I'll give him my vote if he gives me cows. So there is this element. It's very common in Hispanic culture as well, and any Catholic immigrant culture really brings this. I would say, I totally agree with you. You need to educate people. It drives me wild sometimes. We get so fixated on egalitarianism, on saying, everyone needs to, be on the level playing field. We need to get rid of all this power, all this superstructure. But that's a myth, right? There's always going to be a hierarchy just because of human variation and social variation and the way we store capital, even going back to those hunter-gatherers, right? We now know there is social variation. And what I think is more, rather than pretending that doesn't exist or pretending we're all equal or pretending we're all in some kind of competition, right, like the capitalist might, I think we need to tell people that, like, hey, if Carnegie does this, right, with his gospel of wealth. If you have wealth, if you have power, if you have these privileges, you need to be a healthy person in yourself. You can't be a lunatic. You can't be like, I'm sorry, like our celebrity culture, very unhealthy.
No, it's so bad.
And you need to use that power. You have an obligation. You have an obligation to help people. You shouldn't be extravagant and all this other kind of stuff, right? I really do think we need to reintegrate that teaching, right? There's a lot of Greco-Roman, early church teachings, and that's just in the Western world, right? The Islamic world has tons of this. The the Chinese and Japanese world, Hindu world, they have a ton of this knowledge as well. But we need to understand, people all have equal value, but they will likely never have equal power.
Yeah.
And we need to find a way to square that circle, not just pretend, I'm just like you.
Yeah.
There's no difference between me and a immigrant working on a farm for $2. Now we're all the same.
Yeah.
Like, no, both of us just by nature of being here have a certain power and a certain privilege and need to be responsible.
No, for sure. If you have my friend sent me this. Well, first, there's definitely a difference between equity and equality.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, but
I think equity is quite dangerous.
Yeah.
Harrison Bergeron, right? That's that famous novel that we all had to read as kids.
Well, I don't think I had to read that.
Oh, really? It was assigned to us in school. It's Harrison Bergeron. It's this dystopian future.
Is it? My friends always tell me to read this because it would be so good. I'm trying to think what it's called. What is it? I don't remember.
Let me know. Yeah.
Yeah.
But this one, it's a short story. It's basically the government says, oh, we're going to have equity. And the only way they can have equity is if you're over 5'10", they put a weight on your shoulder so you slump down to 5'10". And if you're too smart, they play noise in your ear so you get distracted. And if you're too athletic, they don't feed you enough. So it's basically you have to bring everyone down to make equity.
Yeah, that does not sound like a great spot.
No, because humans have too much variation. I agree. Equality is important, but equity is... It's a dangerous line.
Yeah, I think everyone has their strengths.
Yeah.
And that's how we work. Like, there's historians, philosophers, all these people with different fields and focuses put together. You need each other to make the world run.
Absolutely.
But I forgot where I was before that.
You're talking equity and equality.
Yeah, right before that. My memory. It sounds like they're blasting music in my ears. I don't really remember. It's the mind. The mind. It wanders.
Yeah.
Yeah. What were you saying right before I said the equity and equality? I'm just trying to catch back.
What was I talking? I think I was saying about like all these cultural ideas of if you have the power, you need to.
Oh
give
yeah.
It back,
Okay. There we go.
Give
So
responsibility.
there's Ready Player 2 because I felt I am from a very middle class, lucky to be from New Jersey. Like I could have been born anywhere, like literally anywhere. So I had a sort of guilt of being placed and having this opportunity to go to school for TV, radio, and film and philosophy. Like most people don't have that opportunity.
Right.
I could have been born in North Korea and I would not even know what a trash can is, which is ridiculous to think about. And I can't even wrap my head around it that they literally have to give their poop to the government. But it's just, I don't know why I was born here, but it says in Ready Player 2, and he sent me the quote, and it was just pretty much saying exactly what you're saying. If you have, not everyone starts on the same playing field, but if you have power, you have to use it to help others. You have to use what you have to help the people that do not.
Yeah.
And I really think a lot of people aren't doing that because there's the Pandora files that just got released by the Guardian, some other British organizations, journalists, which is pretty much showing that these very wealthy of the wealth, the people that we don't even know about.
Right.
Like the trillionaires, not even
back room. Yeah.
The people those are the people, people are worried about Bezos and Elon. I'm like,
you worry about pull their strings.
Yeah. I'm like, who's the ones that aren't saying anything? Because those are the ones in the shadows that are pulling everything.
Of course.
So, but they just found that all these people don't have their money in the bank accounts. They don't have to get taxed for these certain things.
Right.
They hide it in offshore accounts. And they pretty much said one person, an individual in one of these offshore accounts has somewhere between in the trillions of dollars. I'm like, those are the people, and we don't even know who they are. Probably oil tycoons or
probably just not even that. I don't really think they'd be productive. I bet they're just bankers. They move money. I feel like investment type.
But it's sketchy. Those types of people, if they could just spread, just do anything to help.
Yeah.
It's just, I know throwing money doesn't always solve things, but you could put it into if I had a bunch of money, what I would do with it is I'd give it to researchers, because that's such a field where so many things could be studied but aren't because they don't have the funding for it.
Absolutely.
So I'm like, just find something you believe in. I don't care what it is. You have to believe in something. It's climate change, donate to climate change. Find some scientists, say, hey, I'll give you $100,000, which is chump change.
Right.
And say,
to them,
you can do whatever you want, study, I want this problem found out.
Sure.
And you can make so much progress just by doing that. I don't get why they don't do it. Yeah. Is it just power? Is it?
Who knows? Right. And it's that element of you can't take it with you, right? What happens when you die? why have these big numbers in your bank account? And just, I don't know. I can't explain it. It's not an area. I really love what you said, though, about, I think one of the most dangerous psychological sort of archetypes that's looming over our society today, and there may be many, but this guilt, right? I really think that's so unhelpful. It's so unproductive. We've acted like, privilege is inherently bad, and if you have this any kind of privilege, economic or or if we say you have this racial privilege, which I think there's definitely debate in that, is it still 1950 where that, but people say you have these privileges, you shouldn't feel guilty for that, right? You should feel exactly what you said. You need to be motivated. No one is helped by you crying into your pillow and saying, oh, I was born in the middle class. Like, oh no, I'm so privileged. Like, no, no one cares. You need to learn how to use what you have to help folk. And I think that the danger of guilt is you can end up with people who just virtue signal. Where it's like, gosh. I think some of the worst, individuals that I know, like on a personal level, that I've experienced in my life, believe all the quote unquote correct things, right? Because it's easy to say, Black Lives Matter, and then, be very bigoted against black people and not have any black neighbors.
Post a black square on your Instagram story, and you've done your job.
Right.
Good job. That bothers me the most.
No. And that to me is the difference between guilt and responsibility. Because it's guilt that makes you believe all these right thoughts and be very dogmatic and post angry things on the internet. But it's responsibility that says, okay, how can I, create jobs that help everyone, action. Or how can I, exactly. How can I study something that matters, that can really help folk, or that people are really interested in, or do a program that gets these kind of ideas, or whatever it is that you do. Exactly. It's no action. I love that.
I mean, that's talk is so cheap. Talk is so cheap.
Ironic on a podcast.
Right. But I know. But this is my voice. I like having different perspectives on. I like hearing people's points, and this is what I can do. Maybe in the future, once I'm done with school, I could do something else. But
no, I think this is good. I don't mean to.
No. I think no. I think it's funny.
It's just ironic, but this is
because I think about that too. I'm
getting the word out there. Absolutely.
I was talking to I think my priest about it too. I'm like, I'm not changing. Like, what am I doing? Like, I talk about all this shit all the time, like the climate, all this stuff, and it's like I'm not really doing anything. I'm just talking about it. Right. And then he was like, well, someone needs to spread the news. Like,
there you are.
Like, all right, I'll take that. But maybe eventually, when I have some, I could do more. But
I mean, when that's the thing, right? We shouldn't pretend that you and I are, we may be a lot more privileged than a slave in a Shanghai factory, but we're still relatively small potatoes, right?
Yeah.
We shouldn't think that the accumulation of more social capital is some grave sin in itself, right?
Yeah.
As long as your responsibility is growing proportional to your power, you do some minor good things every day. That's creates enough for where and that's just enough for where we are in our lives. And as we get more powerful, as you get I'm sure you'll get a much bigger platform in the future. Your field is wonderful because that actually increases, very easily exponentially.
That'd be cool. But there's someone, I forgot who said it to me, but I was talking about the same type of thing, and she's like, I forgot who it was, but it's like a pebble. You throw a pebble in water and it creates a ripple. That ripple effect, you don't know where it goes, and when you get a bigger pebble, it's a rock, it's even bigger.
Oh,
and
I like
boulder,
that.
It's even bigger.
Yeah.
But like I really use the song Ripple by the Grateful Dead as my theme song, as my intro and conclusion. So it's kind of like because
that's a very good nod. I like that.
Yeah. So it's a ripple. And if you listen to the lyrics, it has some more things in it. But that's for another discussion.
Yeah. I think we got a good spot if you're.
Yeah, I think this is perfect. Yeah. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you for having me. It was wonderful to speak and to.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
I'd definitely have you on in the future.
Yeah, I'd be happy to come back.
Yeah, appreciate it. All right.
Yeah.
Peace.
All right.